Hiding the pregnant belly and getting a divorce, CEO Yu searches the world in a frenzy. She's back, let's get a divorce. After 3 years of secret marriage, he got into trouble at her home and asked for a divorce when she was pregnant. He turned a blind eye to her request for help. Extremely disappointed, she hid her pregnant belly and signed the divorce. She thought that after the divorce, the two would go their separate ways, but she didn't expect her pregnancy to be exposed. Faced with the man's proposal to remarry, Yangshi said angrily, "I just want to get rid of the father and keep the son. If you want visitation rights for the child, you have to kneel down and beg me." She thought he would give up, but she didn't expect that she really underestimated someone's thickness of face. Then, on the outdoor big screen in the most prosperous area of Yuncheng, a video of someone kneeling down to ask for remarriage was played all day. Chapter 1, She's pregnant, the company is in crisis. She's pregnant. According to the timeline, it should be from last month, during their final encounter. After that, Yuncheng proposed a divorce. For 3 years, she had desperately hoped for a child with him. But unexpectedly, this child arrived just as they were about to divorce. Yangshi was unsure whether to feel sad or happy. She took the pregnancy test results from her friend, and upon seeing the words, "pregnancy confirmed," her expression was mixed. This child really couldn't have come at a worse time. "You and your husband have decided to divorce." Lu Fangfei's words trailed off, and she sighed lightly. Yangshi gripped the test results tightly, her smile faded, and her tone was bitter. "Yes, it's really bad timing. This child came too suddenly, catching her off guard." She let out a quiet sigh, then spoke in a low voice. "Please keep this a secret for now." Lu Fangfei made an "okay" gesture, understanding the unspoken words. She and Yangshi had been classmates since high school. Later, they both went to medical school, studied abroad for 3 years, and now worked in the same hospital, though in different departments. She was one of the few people who knew about Yangshi's marital situation. As Yangshi was about to leave, Lu Fangfei couldn't help but remind her. "However, if you don't want this child, you need to make a decision quickly. After all, you're about to be evaluated for your professional title later this year. Marriage and career, you should probably focus on one." Hearing these words, Yangshi paused slightly, nodded lightly, then opened the office door and walked out. She would keep the child, but her marriage was beyond saving. Outside the office, the voice of the doctor echoed. "Miss Zhao, you still need to take care of your health, avoid overworking. You're a little anemic, so make sure to eat foods that help with blood production. Otherwise, the baby's nutrition will suffer, which could affect the delivery." "Okay, thank you, Dr. Wang." A soft and gentle voice spoke up, and Yangshi's expression changed slightly. That voice sounded familiar. She had heard it before in her husband's phone. It seemed to belong to his first love. Yangshi, already around the corner, couldn't help but turn her head. She saw a petite, fragile woman standing beside a man with an aloof and noble demeanor. He wore a black shirt with a pair of neat black suit pants. His handsome face could make anyone stop and stare, no matter where he went. Yangshi paused for a moment, her grip tightening on the pregnancy test results. The man was her husband of 3 years, Yuncheng. The doctor was listing a few blood-nourishing foods, and the delicate-looking woman linked arms with the man and coquettishly said, "Sighting, I have a bad memory. You have to remind me." "Okay." The man nodded slightly, his usually cold, ice-like black eyes now softened with a hint of warmth. Yangshi clearly saw this different side of him, a sharp pain passing through her heart but quickly masked. She darkened her face and stood at the corner, pulling out her phone to call her husband. The first time, he hung up. The second time, the call was also dropped. Yangshi had never been a capricious person, but this time, she stubbornly dialed again. On the third call, the phone was finally picked up. "I'm busy." Yuncheng's cold voice cut off any chance for Yangshi to speak, and the call was ended immediately. Yangshi gripped the phone tightly, feeling as though her breath was laced with pain. He was indeed busy accompanying his first love to a pregnancy checkup, busy helping her remember the foods she should eat during pregnancy. 2 years ago, when she was preparing to conceive, he hadn't been this patient. Yangshi took a deep breath and was about to leave, but not far away, she heard the woman's gentle voice. "Sighting, is that a call from the company? Am I taking up your time?" "No." The man's voice was low, almost immediate in response, as though he feared any delay would hurt the woman's feelings. Yang Shi couldn't help but think of how Yu Sighting had treated her during their marriage with indifference, always distant and aloof. It was for this woman that he wanted a divorce. In the past month, he hadn't said a word of explanation, just cold, emotionless divorce papers. She bit her lip and kept her hands in her white coat pockets as she walked out from the corner. Yang Shi was tall, and the simple white coat made her look elegant and modest, with a scholarly, refined air. She smiled faintly, catching the brief moment of confusion in the man's eyes, and softly spoke. How coincidental. It turned out the rumors were true. Yu Sighting's first love had returned, and that's why he was so eager to divorce her. In just 1 month, he had arranged 3 meetings with lawyers to discuss the divorce. Zhao Shuer looked at the poised, beautiful doctor before her, her eyes flickering slightly. She stepped forward and affectionately hooked her arm through Yu Sighting's, looking up at Yang Shi. Sighting, who is this? The man furrowed his brows, his cold gaze landing on Yang Shi, his tone flat and indifferent. My grandmother's god-granddaughter. Before their marriage, Grandma Yu had officially recognized Yang Shi as her god-granddaughter to give her more opportunities to interact with Yu Sighting, often inviting her to their home under various pretexts. Many years had passed, and Yang Shi had forgotten about this detail. To her surprise, Yu Sighting still remembered her relationship with his grandmother. Yang Shi couldn't help but raise a smile, her lips curling into a mocking curve. So, Miss Zhao doesn't know my identity? Her words were double-edged, and as she spoke, she looked at Yu Sighting, her lips curling into a faint smile. Miss Zhao, hello. I am. Before she could finish, she was interrupted by Yu Sighting's indifferent voice. If Dr. Yang has time on her hands, she should visit Mr. Yang. He might need some company. He has probably been upset recently. There was a subtle warning in his cold, dark eyes. Yang Shi paused, her words stuck in her throat. We'll go now. Yu Sighting gave Yang Shi one last indifferent glance, took Zhao Shuer's hand, and left. As they entered the elevator, Zhao Shuer turned around and glanced at Yang Shi. A strange, unreadable emotion flickered in her clear eyes. Since their marriage, Yu Sighting had never admitted to anyone in public that he was married. Few people in Yun City knew of their marital relationship. After all, in his view, it was her who had forced him to marry her, seeking revenge for some past favor, causing Zhao Shuer to leave in heartbreak. Yang Shi's heart twisted painfully, her hands tightly clutching the pregnancy test results in her pocket. Her phone rang. It was the family's butler calling. Yang Shi tried to hold back her tears, but they still threatened to fall. Miss Yang, you need to come to the hospital. Master Yang, he overdosed, attempted suicide. He is being treated in the ER. In the emergency room. When Yang Shi arrived, she saw Yang Ruyu standing at the entrance, her back straight and her dignified, noble presence unmistakable. Yang Shi hurried forward and asked. Sister, Dad is he? Before she could finish, Yang Ruyu's cold voice interrupted her. Have you spoken to Yu Sighting about the company's situation? How did your conversation go? The Yang family business was facing a serious financial crisis. The projects they had signed were all being cancelled, and if Yu Sighting could lend a hand, the Yang group could survive this crisis. Yang Shi lowered her head. Not yet. We're planning to divorce. She bit her lip and couldn't bring herself to look up at Yang Ryu. Yang Ryu stared at her in disbelief, her expression filled with shock. What did you just say? Yang Shi bit her lip even harder. Yang Ryu took a deep breath and glared at Yang Shi with an expression of frustration. Yang Shi, the company's situation is complicated. Dad and I rarely talk to you about it. I told you to ask Yu Sighting for help, and you should have known how serious things are. Dad's still inside, being treated. Does your pride in front of Yu Sighting matter more than your father's life? Chapter 2, It's time to have a child. The Yang family had weathered several economic crises over the years, and each time, with her sister and father's abilities, they had pulled through. Yang Shi thought that this time would be just like every other an obstacle they would overcome, as they had before. She never imagined that things would get this serious. Her father had even tried to take his own life by swallowing pills. Yang Ryu stared at her younger sister, her voice stern and commanding. I don't care what methods you use, you must get Yu Sighting to help the Yang family. Don't forget, it was father who made you marry Yu Sighting, and he sacrificed a lot for that. Now it's time to pay him back. Even if you're divorcing him, you need to scrape a layer of skin off him to help the company through this crisis. Yang Ryu's words were like an order, leaving Yang Shi no room to refuse. Yang Shi felt a bitter taste in her heart. When Yuncheng's parents passed away in a car accident, the company faced a crisis with shareholders turning against them and external competitors increasing pressure. At that time, Yang Shi had secretly harbored feelings for Yuncheng and had hoped her father would help him. Her father went to see Yu old madam, and the next day, the Yu family announced her marriage to Yuncheng. But what she didn't know was that Yuncheng had a first love, and it was because of her that they could never be together. Now, with the tides turned, how could Yuncheng possibly be willing to help her? The lights in the emergency room went out, and Yang Shi's father had been successfully resuscitated. His condition was stable, and he was transferred to a regular ward. Finally, her tense heart eased. Father's out of danger. I'll stay here for now. Remember what I said. I know. Yang Shi answered softly. Sanchi Park City. Yang Shi sat on the sofa and dialed Yuncheng's number. The call was quickly answered, and Yang Shi took a deep breath, speaking calmly. Come back and bring the divorce papers. Without giving him a chance to respond, she ended the call. Half an hour later, the door opened from the outside. Yang Shi, who had been somewhat relaxed, straightened her posture immediately when she heard the sound. Yuncheng walked in, looking weary, his steps long. Yang Shi's clear almond-shaped eyes carried a hint of mockery. The last time he entered here was a month ago. After that night, the lawyer had delivered the divorce papers, with no explanation, as if it was the right time and she simply had to sign. Yang Shi had been confused at first. How could the man who had been so affectionate with her the night before suddenly want a divorce the next day? It wasn't until she saw Zhao Shuer that she understood. Yuncheng stopped in front of Yang Shi and glanced at the divorce papers on the table. The section where Yang Shi was supposed to sign was still blank. She hadn't signed yet. His face immediately showed visible impatience. Yang Shi, what exactly are you trying to pull this time? Have I ever pulled any tricks in front of you? Yang Shi calmly responded, not in a hurry. Yuncheng looked at her expressionlessly, not answering. Yang Shi bit her lip, sighed lightly, and looked up at him with sincere eyes. Is it because Zhao Shuer came back to China that you want a divorce, or is it because the Yang family is in financial trouble, and a fallen rich girl like me no longer suits your status? Yuncheng gave her a brief glance, then walked over to the couch opposite her and sat down. Does it make a difference? His voice was flat, but it was like a knife stabbing into Yang Shi's heart. Yang Shi's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling. She picked up the divorce papers on the table and flipped through them. There was a $50 million alimony and a house, and after flipping 2 more pages, she spoke coldly. I don't want the alimony, but I have one condition. Yuncheng's expression shifted, as if expecting this response. Say it. What's the condition? I want you to help the Yang family through this crisis. Also, after the divorce, no matter the reason, we should not contact each other again. As soon as she finished speaking, a low laugh came from him. Contact? You think I would fall in love with you? His voice was deep, and his black eyes curved slightly, as if hearing a funny joke. Yang Shi listened to his mocking laughter, feeling it was especially grating. His complete disdain made her feel utterly humiliated. Of course, she knew Yuncheng would never bother to entangle himself with her again, but he would fight for custody of the child. Suppressing the discomfort in her heart, she was about to speak when his low, magnetic voice interrupted her again. Yang Shi, I will never love you in this lifetime. I will divorce you, but I refuse to help you. The downfall of the Yang family is inevitable. History changes, and no one can guarantee their family will always be prosperous. Why should I waste time and effort helping a completely corrupt company? When Yuncheng spoke, his eyes were half closed. Yang Shi couldn't see the change in his expression, but she could guess it was extremely cold. Her pupils darkened, and just as she was about to explain for the Yang family, suddenly, his phone on the table vibrated. Upon seeing the caller ID, Yuncheng immediately stood up to answer. After a few seconds, Yang Shi heard him say, Xiao Shui, don't worry, I'll be there soon. Yang Shi froze for a moment. After hanging up, Yuncheng turned to give her one last glance, his tone still indifferent, with no trace of emotion. Yang Shi, let's not waste each other's time. Yang Shi barely responded, and as his footsteps hurriedly left, the sound of his departure echoed in the hallway. She sat dumbfounded on the sofa for a long time before coming back to her senses, her tears finally spilling from her eyes. Her body trembled slightly, trying to hold back her sobs. Since she had lost her mother at a young age, her father had pampered her excessively. She never wanted to manage the company, so her father had supported her in going to medical school. She liked Yuncheng, so her father had helped the Yu family. But she never imagined that one day, the all-powerful father she had relied on would fall, and she could do nothing to help. Her phone rang, and she wiped away her tears, staring at the caller ID. After a moment's hesitation, she answered the call. Hello. She controlled her voice, trying not to let the person on the other end hear their hoarseness. Madam, the old lady wants you to come to the old house for dinner tonight. Okay. The Yu family's old house. I asked Liu to make some chicken soup for you. Drink a lot of it. You've lost weight recently. Grandmother Yu looked at Yingxi with a loving expression, instructing one of the servants to serve her some soup. Thank you, Grandma. Yangxi took the bowl of soup obediently, burying the worries and frustration in her heart, forcing a smile. Grandmother Yu nodded slightly, watching Yangxi drink the soup, then kindly asked, Has Sighting been treating you well lately? Yangxi tightened her grip on the soup spoon, a slight chill running through her fingers. To avoid worrying the old lady, she deepened her smile, her eyes curving happily. Sighting has always been good to me. Grandmother Yu nodded in satisfaction. Speaking of which, it's been a while since you and Sighting got married. It's time to start thinking about having a child. Yangxi paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Suddenly, her heart raced, and she was about to speak when Grandmother Yu added, I heard from Lin that your period hasn't come this month. Chapter 3, Misunderstanding her for so many years. Aunt Lin was a servant that the old Mrs. Yu had specially arranged to look after Yangxi and Yu Sighting's daily needs. She would also report on their lives to the old lady from time to time. Yangxi didn't expect that Aunt Lin remembered even the dates of her period so clearly. It seemed that over the past period, she had been reporting quite a lot to the old Mrs. Yu. Fortunately, when she asked Yu Sighting to come home and sign the divorce papers, she had intentionally sent Aunt Lin away. Otherwise, her secret might have been exposed by now. Xiaoxi, you've been so busy with work lately. Could it be that you're pregnant and didn't notice? Would you like me to accompany you to get a checkup? As soon as the old Mrs. Yu finished speaking, the servant noticed Yu Sighting standing at the door of the dining room. Young master is back. As she spoke, she immediately set out a pair of chopsticks and pulled out a chair for him. Yu Sighting walked into the room and sat down, his cold, dark eyes scrutinizing Yangxi with a hint of curiosity. Pregnant? His mind immediately wandered back to that night a month ago, and his expression grew serious. It wasn't entirely impossible. Yangxi bit her lip, sensing the strong pressure from the opposite side. She took a deep breath and tried to control her emotions, feeling guilty for not being able to meet Yu Sighting's gaze. The department has been particularly busy lately, and I've been under a lot of stress. My period has been delayed due to hormonal imbalance, she said, her voice soft, trying to maintain her usual calm tone. I had a colleague help me with a checkup yesterday, and I'm not pregnant. I'm taking medication to regulate it. She spoke quietly and calmly, lowering her head to drink some soup to hide her nervousness, trying to act casual. Upon hearing her denial, Yu Sighting felt a strange emotion stir inside him, though he quickly suppressed it. He coldly withdrew his gaze, ignoring the strange feeling, and looked at the old Mrs. Yu, speaking in a low voice, Grandmother, you wanted me back for something. The old Mrs. Yu was disappointed after hearing Yangxi wasn't pregnant. She glared at Yu Sighting, reprimanding him without regard for his face. If I hadn't called you back, would you have been too lazy to come check on this old woman of yours? Yu Sighting raised an eyebrow, answering indifferently, no. The old Mrs. Yu snorted, grabbed her cane, and glared at him. Come to the study with me. Yangxi was momentarily stunned and quickly spoke up, Grandmother, you haven't eaten much yet. The old Mrs. Yu softened her tone when facing Yangxi. The doctor told me to eat less in the evening. You should eat more. I'll go with Sighting to the study and chat for a bit. As she spoke, the old lady patted Yangxi's shoulder before walking out of the dining room with her cane. Yu Sighting, with a cold expression on his handsome face, stood up from his chair and cast a fleeting glance at Yangxi before walking away. Yangxi pressed her lips together and put down her soup spoon, her eyes flashing with concern. The door to the study was tightly shut. Yangxi stood at the door, still hearing the old Mrs. Yu's angry voice inside. As long as I'm alive, you'll never let that woman step foot into our Yu family's house. Yangxi bit her lip, realizing that their conversation must be about Zhao Shuai. She took a deep breath and was about to open the study door to try and calm the old lady, but just as her hand touched the doorknob, the door was opened from the inside. The intense cold air from Yuncheng swept over her. Yang Shi froze, looking up at the tall man in front of her. He looked down at her, his dark eyes seemingly filled with ice. Besides flattering and pretending in front of the old lady, what other tricks do you have up your sleeve? Yang Shi was stunned, her beautiful almond eyes filled with confusion and grievance. I haven't done anything. Seeing the change in her expression, Yuncheng unknowingly felt a surge of irritation. The old Mrs. Yu's angry voice could still be heard from inside the study. You've done something wrong yourself. How dare you blame Xiao Shi? Yuncheng furrowed his brows, casting a cold glance at her before walking away. The servant, seeing the situation, quickly entered the study to check on the old lady. Yang Shi's hand, which had been hanging by her side, clenched slightly, her eyes darkening. Although she had tried hard to hide it, she had forgotten that the old Mrs. Yu was eager to know everything, and naturally, someone was helping to collect the information. Yuncheng and Zhao Shuai's appearance at the hospital must have been reported to the old lady. But Yuncheng mistakenly believed that it was Yang Shi who had told the old lady. Is the one who isn't loved supposed to bear all the blame and grievances? Help! The old lady has fainted. A sudden cry from the servant echoed from the study. Yang Shi immediately rushed into the room. At the hospital, after the old Mrs. Yu's condition stabilized, she was moved to a regular ward. Yang Shi quietly sat in a chair outside the ward, thinking about Yuncheng's cold eyes, her heart still aching. Suddenly, a shadow appeared before her. She looked up and saw Yuncheng walking out of the ward with a stern face. He looked down at her, his expression indifferent. Grandmother wants to see you. Upon hearing this, Yang Shi immediately stood up and walked toward the old lady's room. As she passed by him, Yuncheng grabbed her arm. His voice was devoid of warmth. Yang Shi, your goal has been achieved. For the sake of grandmother's health, I won't divorce you for now, but don't think I'll help the Yang family. Yang Shi's almond eyes flashed slightly, and she looked up at Yuncheng, but remained silent. Yuncheng looked at her, seeing her eyes glisten with tears, and his cold gaze seemed to freeze. He suddenly felt that her arm had become burning hot. He released her arm with a cold expression, not sparing her another glance. Yang Shi steadied her emotions, knowing that Yuncheng had already assumed this was her strategy, and she chose not to explain further. She walked into the old Mrs. Yu's ward. The divorce still had to happen, but not now. She walked into the ward and put on a smile again. Grandmother, do you feel better? The old lady weakly raised her hand, and Yang Shi immediately walked over, holding her hand and sitting down on the chair beside her. Xiao Shi, I know I've made you suffer all these years. You're a good child, it's all because of my selfishness that I've delayed you. When the Yu family ran into trouble, only the Yang family was willing to help. I knew how you felt about Siting, so I took the opportunity to arrange your marriage. The old Mrs. Yu's voice was tinged with some sadness, and her wrinkled eyes were slightly red. Yang Shi felt a surge of complicated emotions upon hearing her words. The old lady wiped her eyes and spoke with helplessness. That woman, Zhao Shuai, isn't he as gentle and kind as she appears? When the Yu family ran into trouble, she ran overseas. Siting still can't see through her false exterior, and he has misunderstood you for so many years. Chapter 4 Long time no see. This is all my fault. If she had not strongly opposed Yuncheng and Zhao Shuai being together, perhaps Yuncheng would have seen through Zhao Shuai's true face long ago. Yang Shi bit her lip, her heart was deeply moved, her nose felt sore, and it seemed as if a myriad of grievances surged into her heart. She held her breath, suppressed the urge to cry, smiled slightly, and spoke softly. Grandma, it's not your fault. Siting and I are not meant to be together. She and Yuncheng have been married for 3 years. Even if she covered an iceberg, a corner of it would have melted by now, but Yuncheng still hasn't fallen in love with her, so she can't blame anyone. Old Madam Yu held Yang Shi's hand tightly and said, My dear child, sooner or later Siting will realize that you are the one who truly loves him. As long as Grandma is here, the position of the young mistress of the Yu family will always be yours. Old Mrs. Yu looked solemn, and Yang Shi was deeply moved. Even if her marriage with Yuncheng could not last too long, she still gained a grandmother who treated her sincerely in this marriage. So, it doesn't seem to be such a pity. Yang Shi waited until old Mrs. Yu fell asleep before leaving the ward. She walked out of the ward, closed the door quietly, and glanced sideways to see Yuncheng sitting on a chair outside the ward. Their eyes met at the same time. Yang Shi immediately looked away and replied calmly. "Grandma is asleep. You go back, I'll stay here." As soon as she finished speaking, the servant on the side immediately spoke. "Master, madam, you two can go back and have a rest. I'll just stay here and look after the old lady. You and the young master still have to work tomorrow. You still have to perform surgery on patients. You can't be careless and you need to rest." Yang Shi was about to speak when Yuncheng stood up from his chair, glanced at her coldly, and said in a deep voice, "I'll take you back." Yang Shi wanted to refuse, but the man walked past her with a sullen face. She bit her lip and followed Yuncheng out of the hospital. Yuncheng glanced sideways and could see Yang Shi following behind him from the figure reflected in the window. She hung her head, feeling inexplicably pitiful. The two walked in silence. When they arrived at the residence, after Yuncheng stopped the car, Yang Shi was the first to open the door and get out. Her pace was much faster than before. Yuncheng frowned, the words on his lips got stuck in his throat, and his eyes darkened slightly. "Drive." Yang Shi watched the car leave without trying to stop them. They would get divorced sooner or later, and since Yuncheng refused to help Yang, she would have to think of other ways. There is also a child. Yang Shi gently stroked her belly. She didn't know how long she could keep it secret. The car drove for a long time, but Yuncheng's mind emerged the distraught look of Yang Shi when he rejected her divorce conditions. A wave of restlessness surged in his heart. He tugged at his tie with his hands with distinct knuckles, and his eyes became cold and sharp. "Check which companies have broken their contracts with Yang's." A cold voice sounded in the car. The assistant in the front seat was stunned for a moment, thinking he had misheard. He glanced at the expressionless man in the rearview mirror and quickly responded. "Yes, President." That night, Yuncheng still did not return home. The next morning, Yang Shi got up early and cooked some porridge for old lady Yu and brought it to the hospital. As she stepped into the hospital with her lunchbox, she ran into Yuncheng, who was looking tired, walking out. He was still wearing the same suit he wore when he left last night, and his handsome face was full of fatigue. Could it be that he actually stayed here with Grandma the whole night last night? There was a hint of astonishment in Yang Shi's eyes. She pursed her lips slightly, stepped forward, and was about to greet Yuncheng when a clear and surprised male voice sounded from not far away. "Yang Shi." Yang Shi turned around, her eyes filled with surprise and astonishment that were difficult to conceal. "West City." Her voice was puzzled at first, but then she confirmed that the man standing not far away was her childhood playmate Yuncheng, who had immigrated abroad with his family a few years ago. "Haven't seen you for a long time." With a smile in her eyes, she walked towards Yuncheng. Yuncheng also walked over quickly, stretched out his long arms, took Yang Shi into his arms, gave her a big hug, and did not let go for a long time. "It's been a while since we last met. I wonder if you missed me during the time I was away." Yang Shi was stunned for a moment, feeling a little unable to adapt to being suddenly hugged by a man. She was a little embarrassed, but thinking of the fact that Yuncheng had lived abroad for many years, a simple hug was like a handshake to him, just a courtesy. Her eyes almost immediately looked for Yuncheng, and she wanted to explain in a hurry. When Yuncheng raised his eyes, he saw Yang Shi being pulled into the arms of a man. His steps paused slightly, his brows and eyes were cold. Seeing that Yang Shi did not struggle, his eyes became even colder. He frowned, withdrew his gaze from the two of them, and strode away. Yang Shi saw Yuncheng walking straight out of the hospital without even looking at her from beginning to end, and a gloomy look flashed across his eyes. "Certainly." She answered Yuncheng's words softly, her tone full of fatigue. She not only missed Yuncheng, but also wanted to go back to the time when Yuncheng had not immigrated abroad. At that time, she had not yet met Yuncheng and had not yet fallen in love. Everything was beautiful and she had no worries. After many years, Yuncheng's features are still clear and bright, but she looks a little haggard recently. Yang Shi took a step back and walked out of Yuncheng's arms. Yuncheng couldn't help but raise his eyebrows when his arms suddenly felt empty. Yang Shi smiled and took the initiative to change the subject. "Are you feeling unwell?" Yuncheng shook his head slightly, looked at Yang Shi with sharp eyes, and said with a smile, "I came here specifically to see you." Yang Shi was stunned for a moment, with a look of puzzlement and confusion, and her eyes instinctively caught Yu Sighting's figure. Qin Shiqing looked at her reaction, laughed out loud, and spoke in a soft tone. You cried so hard when I went abroad, so I wanted to see you first when I returned home. It just so happens that I need to have a physical examination during this period, so I specially made an appointment with you. Yang Shi pursed her red lips as she listened to Qin Shiqing's words. The Qin family was next door to the Yang family at that time, and Qin Shiqing and Yang Shi grew up together. They separated in high school, so Yang Shi was naturally reluctant to let go. So after Qin Shiqing left, she was sad for a long time, but this had nothing to do with love. Her eyes happened to sweep across Yu Shighting's back. His receding figure seemed to be telling Yang Shi that he was not interested in the conversation between her and other men. Outside the hospital, the driver had arrived and parked the car in front of Yu Sighting. The man bent down and got into the car without stopping. They have been married for 3 years and few outsiders know about their marriage. Yu Sighting must have left in such a hurry just now because he didn't want her to come forward and say hello to him. After all, he had never wanted to make their relationship public. Yang Shi retracted her gaze, glanced at the lunchbox in her hand that she had not yet delivered to old Madame Yu, then raised her eyes to look at Qin Shiqing, smiled slightly, and concealed all her loss and sadness. I need to deliver something to someone. Please wait for me in my office. I will be back to examine you soon. Qin Shiqing nodded slightly, withdrew his gaze from Yang Shi's leaving body, and looked in the direction where Yu Sighting's car drove away. Outside the hospital, Yu Sighting got into the car with a cold face. The inexplicable anxiety rising in his heart made all his displeasure clearly written on his face. The assistant who was driving in front saw that his face was uglier than any time before, and was so scared that he dared not breathe. After realizing his own gaffe, Yu Sighting's deep black eyes darkened a little. After calming down, he asked indifferently. Have you found out what I asked you to check yesterday? Chapter 5, Shamelessly Coming Over. Yu Sighting suddenly spoke, and Assistant Chen immediately realized that he was asking about the situation of the Yang family. I found it. The land that the Yang family spent a huge amount of money to buy in recent years has fallen into dispute, the project has been delayed and the funds cannot be recovered. In addition, as debts matured this year, upstream material suppliers and builders broke contracts, causing some ongoing projects to be suspended, resulting in huge losses and inability to repay debts, so capital turnover has reached a dead end. Yu Sighting frowned, looking solemn. If Yang's company does not reinvest a large amount of funds to accelerate the progress of the project, it may be too late to save the situation. No wonder Yang Shi proposed that she would divorce him if he helped Yang family. Seeing that Yu Sighting's eyes were deep and he didn't say a word, the assistant spoke again carefully. I heard that the lady's sister has recently started selling off Yang's real estate to pay off debts, but the price has been maliciously suppressed, 30% or even lower than the market price. Now many people in the North City business circle are waiting for Yang to collapse so that they can take advantage of the bargain. The assistant thought that Yu Sighting would take action after learning about these circumstances, but he just sat in the back with a cold look in his eyes and did not express any opinions, which made people puzzled. Hospital. Yang Shi was checking Qin Shiqing's medical report. She read it carefully and after making sure there was no problem, she handed the report to Qin Shiqing. Your body functions are healthy. Here is your examination report, remember to keep it well. Qin Shiqing looked at Yang Shi, who had a serious expression on her face, and said softly with a smile on his face. It's hard to imagine that you, who used to be a crybaby, have become an excellent attending physician. He reached out and took the diagnosis report handed over by Yang Shi, glanced at it briefly, and smiled. If I remember correctly, you said you wanted to be like your sister. How come you suddenly became a doctor? The smile on Yang Shi's face froze for a moment. Yu Sighting had been injured a few years ago and almost lost his life. At that time, Yang Shi was secretly in love with him. The girl's mind was the strongest, and despite her sister's opposition, she chose to apply for Beijing Medical University. Thinking back to her youthful impulsiveness, Yang Shi couldn't help but feel regretful. If she had not studied medicine, she would be working hard for the Yang group now. It was a coincidence. Yang Shi replied softly with 4 words, the melancholy in the depths of her eyes unable to be concealed. There was always a smile on Qin Shiqing's lips, but his clear eyes concealed a hint of depth and obscurity. It's good to study medicine, so that I can contribute to the people. Yang group will definitely be able to survive this difficult time, Xiaoxi, don't worry too much. As Qin Shiqing spoke, he reached out and rubbed Yang Shi's head. His movements were extremely gentle, just like they did in the past. I'll take you to meet some real estate tycoons tonight. They should be very interested in the projects in the Yang family's hands. When Yang Shi heard the words, Yang Group, her face immediately became sad. Excuse me, is Dr. Yang here? The office door was pushed open from the outside. Zhao Shuai was standing at the door of the office. She was stunned for a moment when she saw this scene, then she smiled awkwardly and spoke softly. I'm sorry, I noticed the door wasn't closed tightly, so. I didn't disturb you, did I? Seeing a patient coming in, Qin Shiqing calmly withdrew his hand, picked up the diagnosis report on the table and stood up from his chair. I'll pick you up after get off work. Before Yang Shi could answer, he walked away. Zhao Shuai smiled and moved aside to let Qin Shiqing go out. Doctor, is this your boyfriend? He's so handsome. Yang Shi's eyes darkened slightly, and she did not explain. When she saw Zhao Shuai standing at the door, she asked with a puzzled look on her face. Miss Zhao, do you have something to talk to me about? Zhao Shuai was pleasantly surprised when she saw Yang Shi. You are the granddaughter that grandma you adopted yesterday, and Sai Ting's god sister. Yang Shi did not answer Zhao Shuai, her eyes fell on the examination report in her hand. Zhao Shuai reacted and immediately took the examination report to Yang Shi, saying with a little pain. Dr. Lu Fangfei from the Obstetrics and Gynecology Department asked me to bring this report up to you. There was some confusion in Yang Shi's eyes. Why would Lu Fangfei push this hot potato in front of her? She reached out to take the examination report handed over by Zhao Shuai, and her eyes changed slightly when she saw the diagnosis description on the top of the report. Zhao Shuai is not pregnant. Yang Shi flipped through Zhao Shuai's medical record with a serious expression. Seeing this, Zhao Shuai quickly asked, Dr. Yang, is there something wrong with my body? Yang Shi hummed solemnly, raised her eyes to look at Zhao Shuai, and said in a deep voice, your examination report today did not show a live fetus in the uterus. Further examination is needed. There are generally two situations in which a misdiagnosed pregnancy can be caused. One is an ectopic pregnancy, and the other is an ovarian tumor. In the remaining two cases, family members need to come and sign to have the surgery as soon as possible. Zhao Shuai's expression was a little stiff. She lowered her head and remained silent for a long time. Then she looked up at Yang Shi and said something that was difficult to say. Can I ask my boyfriend to come over and sign? Yang Shi paused as she was writing out the checklist, feeling a little bitter in her heart. Can. She said this in a calm voice, handed the list in her hand to Zhao Shuai, and asked Zhao Shuai to queue up for inspection. Zhao Shuai nodded, took the checklist, stood up, took out her cell phone and called Yu Sighting. Her voice was weak but filled with fear and collapse, as if she had some incurable disease. Sai Ting, please come to the hospital. There's something wrong with my body. Yang Shi looked at Zhao Shuai's back as she left and rubbed her eyebrows. As expected, women who act like a spoiled child have the best life? She laughed at herself and sorted out the documents on her desk. Fortunately, she had an operation soon, otherwise she would have to meet Yu Sighting face to face. Yang Shi felt like she was having a heart attack when she thought about her husband bringing his first love to see her, his legal wife. In order not to be affected by them, Yang Shi went to the operating table in advance to prepare for the operation. 4 hours later, Yang Shi got off the operating table. It was already dark outside. After 4 hours of intensive work, she was physically and mentally exhausted. Plus, it was early pregnancy, and her hands were shaking when she came out of the operating room. Seeing that she was exhausted, the male intern doctor led by Yang Shi immediately walked over and held her hand, with a respectful look on his face. Teacher Yang, you have worked hard. She smiled warmly, but did not reject the intern's kindness. She joked to herself, I'm old and useless now. As soon as she finished speaking, she felt a sharp gaze. She looked sideways and saw Yu Sighting and Zhao Shuai standing not far away with sullen faces. Yang Shi paused and slowly pulled her hand back from the intern's hand. At their side, the director of their department was smiling apologetically and quickly walked forward to greet Yang Shi. Dr. Yang, you are finally off the operating table. President Yu and Miss Zhao have been waiting for you for several hours. Boss Yu is very impressed with your medical skills and has specifically asked you to perform surgery on Miss Zhao. Please help Miss Zhao. The director smiled and said in a voice that only he and Yang Shi could hear, Boss Yu said that as long as you help Miss Zhao with the surgery, he will donate a batch of brand new medical equipment to the hospital. Yang Shi, whether the patients in our hospital can use the new medical equipment depends on you. Yang Shi frowned. Even though she had a good temper, she still looked a little unhappy. Yuncheng is simply sick. She has deliberately avoided them, but he still has the audacity to come over. He wasn't afraid that she would lose control of her emotions on the operating table and kill his white moonlight. Chapter 6, Postpone other surgeries and free up time. The director had a smile on his face as he brought Yang Shi to Yuncheng. When he was about to introduce her, Yang Shi, who was always gentle and kind, spoke first. I refuse to operate on her. As soon as she said this, the director and Zhao Shuai were both shocked. Zhao Shuai spoke before the director did. Why? The director also looked at Yang Shi anxiously, with a look of why on his face. Yang Shi curled her slightly pale red lips, her eyes fell on Yuncheng, and she smiled faintly. I'm fully booked for surgeries lately, so I really don't have time. We have many more excellent doctors in our department, and our director is also an outstanding talent in this field. He will definitely be more reliable than me in performing surgery on Miss Zhao. When the director heard the voice, his face was filled with joy at being praised by Yang Shi. Just as he was about to recommend himself, the man's clear voice rang out. Put aside other surgeries and free up time. Yuncheng just stood there opposite Yang Shi, his face expressionless but revealing a sense of oppression that could not be ignored. His eyes passed from Yang Shi to the director beside him and asked, Can you arrange it? The director looked at Yang Shi, then at Yuncheng, and felt that there seemed to be something wrong with the aura between the two of them. But for the sake of the overall situation, the director agreed without hesitation, of course. After he finished speaking, he tugged at Yang Shi's sleeve and muttered something under his breath. I will complete your minor surgery tomorrow. You can just focus on operating on Miss Zhao. The hospital's investment depends on you. Yang Shi frowned, her expression full of resistance, and looked at Yuncheng solemnly. I've been in a bad mental state recently. Can Mr. Yu really trust his girlfriend to me? After all, medical accidents often happen on the operating table. You must be careful. The director was stunned for a moment, smiled awkwardly, and quickly apologized to Yuncheng. Dr. Yang might be too tired, so he spoke without thinking. President Yu, please don't blame him. Yang Shi turned away with a sullen face. When she raised her eyes, she saw Qin Shicheng standing not far away waiting for her. Qin Shicheng waved at her with a smile on his face. After noticing the fatigue in her eyes and brows, he strode over, reached out and rubbed Yang Shi's head with tenderness in his eyes. Why do you look like you're about to fall apart? Seeing that you look so tired, let's cancel our date tonight. Yang Shi suddenly remembered that Qin Shicheng said he would introduce her to a few real estate tycoons. If the Yang family's idle land could be acquired, it would give the Yang family some relief. No, tonight's date must go on. I'm not tired at all. She immediately perked up, strode to her office, took off her white coat, and left with Qin Shicheng. Zhao Shuai looked at Yang Shi's leaving back and said with a slightly envious tone. Dr. Yang's boyfriend really loves her. He sends her to work in the morning and picks her up in the evening. As she spoke, Yuan looked up at Yuncheng who was standing beside her, only to see that his face was gloomy, his deep eyes were tinged with a bit of unknown anger, and his eyes were cold. I'll ask Assistant Chen to help you get admitted to the hospital. I have something else to do, so I'll leave first. Yuncheng walked into the elevator with a cold face, without stopping at all. Zhao Shuai stood there, watching the elevator door close, and her hands hanging by her side suddenly clenched. Qin Shicheng led Yang Shi straight to their hotel. In the private room, there were only 3 empty seats, the rest were already full. Qin Shicheng entered the private room, pulled out a chair and asked Yang Shi to sit down first, then he apologized to everyone with a smile. Sorry, there was a traffic jam on the road. I'm late. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. Those present were all well-known figures in Yuncheng's business circle. As an old and famous family in Yuncheng, although the Qin family has not developed in the country in recent years, they have always maintained their network of contacts in Yuncheng. Qin Shicheng is now the one in charge of the Qin family, so naturally everyone is willing to give Qin Shicheng some face. It's okay, we just got here a while ago. However, since you are late, you must drink 3 cups as punishment. Qin Shicheng agreed with a smile. At the beginning of the dinner, Qin Shicheng's meticulous care for Yang Shi and their extraordinary relationship made everyone more optimistic about the Yang Group. When talking about the projects under the name of Yang Group, Yang Shi could tell a thing or two about it. With Qin Shiqing's help, some people were tempted to buy the land. The city's development focus is now moving towards the western suburbs and the northern part of the city. The land in the southern suburbs of the Yang Group has no prospects in the next 10 years, so it doesn't seem to make much sense to invest in it. Mr. Qin has just returned from abroad. He needs to learn more about the market and development of Yuncheng. Yu Sighting's words came from outside the door. His tone was very light, but Yang Shi heard a hint of sarcasm in it. As soon as he arrived, everyone stood up from their seats. "Boss Yu, didn't you say that you had something urgent to do and couldn't come? We started the meal without even waiting for you. This was a mistake." The middleman who organized the dinner party hurriedly stood up to greet Yu Sighting, wanting to give up his seat to him. "Mr. Yu, please sit here." Yu Sighting didn't even look at the host, but pulled open the chair next to Yang Shi and sat down. Yang Shi felt that the air pressure around her seemed to suddenly drop, and she immediately straightened her back. She knew that Yu Sighting would not let her off easily. But I didn't expect that not only did he not help Yang's, but he also ruined Yang's business. The atmosphere was a bit awkward. Yang Shi bit her lip lightly and glanced sideways at Yu Sighting. Yu Sighting also looked at her calmly, his calm and composed appearance, as if the person who had just disrupted her business was not him. Seeing this, everyone took their seats to ease the atmosphere. Yang Shi pursed her red lips and calmed herself down. Just as she was about to speak, Qin Shiqing, who was sitting next to her, spoke first. "That may not be the case. Boss, you may have forgotten that there is a 1,000-year-old temple in the southern suburbs." Yu Sighting lowered his eyes, and his gaze lingered on Yang Shi and Qin Shiqing for a few seconds. Yang Shi clearly caught a hint of sarcasm in his deep black pupils. Seeing that Yu Sighting was about to speak to refute Qin Shiqing, she quickly reached out her hand under the table and pressed it on his leg. "If he continues to talk nonsense, I'm afraid no one will buy this piece of land." Her soft and weak hand suddenly rested on his leg. Yu Sighting couldn't help but raise his eyes slightly, and glanced at her slender and white hand with his mysterious eyes. The skin she touched seemed to ignite a small flame. But the woman in front of him looked calm and composed. She glanced at him sideways and forced a smile that couldn't be more fake. "Mr. Yu, Nanjiao is indeed not within the city center planning, but does it have commercial value to transform the 1,000-year-old temple into a commercial district and set up tourist attractions to attract foreign tourists?" Yu Sighting looked at her, his narrow eyes slightly narrowed, as if he was considering. Yang Shi suddenly became nervous. She was very aware that whether the Yang family could sell this piece of land in the southern suburbs depended on Yu Sighting's attitude at the moment. Her beautiful almond-shaped eyes flickered slightly, and she looked straight at the man in front of her, afraid that he would utter a word that would make her previous words collapse. Yu Sighting replied calmly, his usually indifferent tone now having a hint of hoarseness. "Such a plan is indeed valuable." After hearing Yu Sighting's words, Yang Shi secretly breathed a sigh of relief and slowly pulled her hand back. But the next second, the man directly held her hand. Chapter 7 Yang Shi, remember your identity. A hint of confusion flashed across Yang Shi's eyes, and she looked up at Yu Sighting. Yu Sighting just curled the corners of his lips slightly, not understanding why, and let go of her hand the next second. Yang Shi withdrew her hand in confusion. Qin Shiqing's eyes darkened a little on the side, and the veins on his hand holding the chopsticks were visibly bulging, but he still controlled his emotions and picked up food for Yang Shi with a gentle face. Yang Shi didn't notice the mood changes around Qin Shiqing and thanked him quietly. At the dinner, Qin Shiqing took on the full responsibility of protecting Yang Shi's image. Yang Shi still had to go on the operating table tomorrow and couldn't drink, so he helped Yang Shi block the alcohol throughout the whole process. When the dinner was over, Qin Shiqing was already visibly drunk. When leaving the table, someone patted Qin Shiqing on the shoulder and looked at Yang Shi teasingly. "Mr. Qin loves Miss Yang so much. Miss Yang, please take good care of Mr. Qin when you go back." When Yang Shi heard their voice, there was a hint of embarrassment in her eyes, but Qin Shiqing leaned towards Yang Shi and put his hand on the back of her chair. The distance between them was intimate, revealing an ambiguous atmosphere. "You don't have to worry. Xiaoxi has a gentle and kind personality and will naturally take good care of me." A layer of coldness covered Yu Sighting's handsome face, his black eyes sank slightly, he slowly stood up from his chair, glanced at Yang Shi, sneered, and walked away. Yang Shi was full of confusion, not knowing how she had offended him again. Qin Shiqing blocked a lot of alcohol for her tonight, and Yang Shi was very grateful. She was not good at socializing, and was almost ruined by Yuncheng. If it weren't for Qin Shicheng's help, she would have been so nervous that she couldn't speak. Shicheng, can you still stand up? She bent down to check on Qin Shicheng's condition and saw that he was already drunk, so she reached out and put his arm on her shoulders, pulled him up from the chair, put her arms around his waist to control the strength, and walked out with difficulty. Yuncheng was sitting in the car. When he saw Yang Shi holding Qin Shicheng's waist and staggering out, his eyes instantly darkened. Assistant Chen was sitting in the cab and felt the air pressure around him was very low. He glanced at the entrance of the hotel, swallowed secretly, and spoke carefully. Boss Yu, I'll go help the madam. Yuncheng withdrew his gaze from the window expressionlessly and did not answer. With Assistant Chen's experience of working beside him for so many years, he opened the car door, got out, and walked quickly towards Yang Shi. Let me help you. Leave it to me. Yang Shi had performed surgery for more than 4 hours and was exhausted. It was indeed difficult for her to support Qin Shicheng. Seeing Assistant Chen coming to help, she immediately handed Qin Shicheng to Assistant Chen and then reached out to stop a taxi. Assistant Chen immediately put Qin Shicheng in the back seat of the taxi. Yang Shi immediately opened the passenger door of the taxi and got in. After thanking Assistant Chen, she told the driver to drive to the Four Seasons Hotel. Assistant Chen was about to tell Yang Shi that Yuncheng was still waiting for her in the car, but he didn't expect Yang Shi to get into a taxi and leave with Qin Shicheng. He looked back awkwardly at the luxury car parked not far away, and felt a murderous look flashing towards him from the back seat. Four Seasons Hotel. Yang Shi struggled to pull Qin Shicheng out of the taxi, and helped him to the hotel lobby. After shaking him all the way, Qin Shicheng finally vomited. Qin Shicheng's vomiting caused Yang Shi, who was in the early stages of pregnancy, to dry heave. The Four Seasons Hotel is owned by the Qin family. When the person in charge saw Qin Shicheng drunk, he immediately came to help. Qin Shicheng was quickly helped into the room. When the person in charge saw that Yang Shi was covered in stains from Qin Shicheng's vomit, he immediately ordered the receptionist at the front desk to get Yang Shi some spare clothes and take her to another guest room to wash. The smell on Yang Shi's body was really bad. Even though she changed into clean clothes after washing up, she still kept retching, as if the unpleasant smell was still lingering on her body. Ms. Yan, why don't you stay here tonight? We have extra suites in our hotel. Seeing that Yang Shi was really upset and wanted to leave, the person in charge tried to keep her. Yang Shi shook her head, dry heaved twice, and politely refused. I have to go to work tomorrow, and I have some patient's information at home. She said this and walked out of the hotel. The night breeze blew by, and the churning feeling in my stomach was slightly relieved. Assistant Chen sat in the cab and glanced at the rearview mirror very carefully. Yuncheng, who was sitting in the back seat, looked in the direction of Yang Shi with cold eyes, his expression so gloomy that water could drip out of it. He took a deep breath, not daring to breathe out. Yang Shi and Qin Shicheng entered the hotel together for 40 minutes, and came out changed into clothes with wet hair, as if they had just taken a shower. Any adult knows what this means. Drive. Yuncheng ordered in a cold voice. Assistant Chen did not dare to delay and immediately started the car and drove away quickly. Yang Shi waited on the roadside for about 10 minutes before a taxi came. When I got back to my residence, it was already past 12 o'clock. She walked into the living room and just as she put on her shoes, she was met with a cold and handsome face. Yang Shi stood there in a daze. She didn't expect that Yuncheng would be at home. Ever since that incident last month, Yuncheng was unwilling to set foot here. Even when he sent her back that day, he was unwilling to enter the house. His eyes fell on her sharply, and seeing her standing at the door, her pale face showed a hint of astonishment, and her expression became even more gloomy. Come over. He spoke expressionlessly, his tone carrying an irresistible command. Yang Shi bit her lip lightly without leaving any trace, walked over and asked, "What's up?" Before she could finish her words, the man spoke again, his voice as sharp as the cold wind. "Take off your clothes." Yang Shi's body trembled slightly and she looked at him in confusion. After realizing Yuncheng's suspicion, her expression froze slightly. "Do you suspect that I have an affair with Qin Shicheng?" Aunt Lin was standing on the side. When she heard Yang Shi's words, she quickly tried to smooth things over. "Master, there must be some misunderstanding here. Madam is not the kind of person who is fickle." Yuncheng interrupted Aunt Lin and his cold and sharp voice sounded again. "Take off your clothes." There was already a hint of anger in his voice. Yang Shi bit her lips tightly, lowered her eyes, and slowly unbuttoned her clothes. Seeing this, Aunt Lin hurried over and held Yang Shi's hand. "Madam, please don't." Yang Shi pushed Aunt Lin's hand away. "Aunt Lin, it's okay. You and I are both women. It doesn't matter to me," she said, already unbuttoning her shirt and taking it off. Aunt Lin looked away in embarrassment when she saw this. Yang Shi's smooth and fair skin was exposed to the air. Seeing that Yuncheng did not call for a stop, she turned her hands behind her back and unbuttoned the buttons on her back. Yuncheng looked at her frank and stubborn appearance with a cold face. His expression turned cold. He stood up suddenly, grabbed the suit jacket hanging on the hanger and wrapped it around her. His eyes were sinister and cold in a warning. "Yang Shi, remember your identity." Chapter 8, 3 years and 2 children. "You and I haven't divorced yet." Yang Shi has a thin figure, and she looks even thinner when tightly wrapped in the man's suit jacket. Yuncheng clutched his suit jacket tightly, his deep and intense black eyes hinting at anger. No man would allow his wife to flirt with other men in front of him, and the mistake Yang Shi made today touched his bottom line. "I see." Yang Shi pulled her suit jacket slightly, and Yuncheng frowned and let go of her hand. She pursed her red lips, lowered her beautiful eyes, and walked past the man without looking at his expression. The nonchalance in her tone annoyed Yuncheng. He tugged at his tie with a sullen face, looked at Aunt Lin standing on the side, and gave orders in a cold voice. "Cook her something to eat." At the dinner tonight, Yang Shi was so busy promoting the land owned by the Yang family that he didn't even move his chopsticks the entire night. Aunt Lin responded immediately, "Okay, master." Yang Shi went upstairs to the bedroom, threw Yuncheng's coat on the sofa on the side, and went straight into the bathroom. When she came out of the bathroom, Aunt Lin had already prepared a midnight snack. "Madam, the master said you didn't eat much tonight, so he asked me to cook you a midnight snack." Yang Shi paused, opened the bedroom door and walked out. She has a baby in her belly now, so she has to eat something even if she has no appetite. When she went downstairs, Yuncheng was nowhere to be seen. She didn't ask either. Zhao Shuai's surgery was finally scheduled for 3 days later. While the director was formulating the surgical plan, Yuncheng was listening on the side. Yang Shi was directly arranged by the director to be Zhao Shuai's chief surgeon. "Dr. Yang, you have performed thousands of similar operations since you entered the hospital. You are very experienced. I believe that you will also be able to perform Miss Zhao's operation successfully. In the second half of the year, I will share with you some of my experiences as a veteran during the promotion process." Yang Shi frowned, closed the patient's case in her hand, looked up at Yuncheng, and spoke slowly. "It's fine if you want me to take over this operation. Mr. Yu, please stay and let's talk alone." Zhao Shuai looked well behaved and sat quietly beside Yuncheng. When she saw Yang Shi asking Yuncheng to stay, there was some confusion and bewilderment in her eyes. "What about me?" Yang Shi didn't say anything. Yuncheng looked at her calmly and comforted her. "Go outside and wait for me." Zhao Shuai nodded, then slowly stood up from her chair and left, looking back every few steps. The director and his group left shortly after, leaving only Yuncheng and Yang Shi in the huge conference room. Yang Shi was wearing a spotless white coat, with her long black hair neatly tied up behind her head, giving her a dignified and serious temperament. Yuncheng just glanced at her and then looked away. "What do you want to talk to me about?" Yang Shi lowered her head and looked through Zhao Shuai's examination report. Zhao Shuai's operation was not difficult. She didn't understand why Yuncheng insisted on her participating in Zhao Shuai's operation. However, since they insisted so much, Yang Shi naturally had to put forward some conditions. "I can help Miss Zhao with the surgery, but I have a condition." Yuncheng raised his eyelids, glanced at Yang Shi with his deep black eyes, and spoke indifferently before Yang Shi made a request. "Yang family." Yang Shi nodded. Yuncheng looked at Yang Shi, his lips slightly raised, but the smile did not reach his eyes, and there seemed to be a hint of sarcasm in his eyes. "Dr. Yang, you take yourself too seriously. It was just a minor operation, and she wanted him to help Yang." Yang Shi was very calm. Facing his ridicule, her beautiful eyes drooped slightly, without any emotion. "Mr. Yu, you took Miss Zhao too seriously. You insisted that I perform surgery on Miss Zhao. I think you would not refuse this request." After Yang Shi finished speaking, she stood up and left the meeting room. Zhao Shuai waited at the door the whole time. When she saw Yang Shi come out, she greeted her with a smile. "Dr. Yang." Yang Shi also smiled at Zhao Shuai, but this smile was particularly fake. If President Yu loves you enough, he will definitely agree to my conditions. Miss Zhao doesn't have to worry too much. Behind Yu Sighting's voice came. Good. I agree to your terms. If anything goes wrong with her surgery in 3 days, you should know the consequences. Yu Sighting glanced at her coldly. Yang Shi smiled, don't worry, Mr. Yu. Not only can I help Miss Zhao complete this operation successfully, but I can also save her uterus, so that you can have 2 babies in 3 years. Yu Sighting's eyes darkened, he glared at her with a complicated expression, and walked away. Zhao Shuai was stunned for a moment, looked at Yang Shi, then turned her gaze to Yu Sighting and chased after him. Sighting, what conditions did you agree to with Dr. Yang? Yu Sighting really loves her enough. Yang Shi looked at their backs as they left, a hint of self-mockery appeared on the corner of her lips, and she turned back to the office. As soon as she sat down, Yang Ruyu called. I heard from Shicheng that he took you to a social event last night. The contract for the land in the southern suburbs has been drawn up. Thank you for your hard work. Her sister's tone of voice softened when she spoke to her, which was rare. Yang Shi pursed her red lips and said, softly. Yang Ruyu was silent for a few seconds and spoke again. How are you and Yu Sighting doing these days? Yang Shi bit her lip lightly, took a deep breath, and said slowly, fortunately, we don't have to get divorced for the time being. Yang Ruyu smiled coldly. I heard that Yu Sighting's first love has returned to China. Yu Sighting has always believed that you teamed up with the old lady of the Yu family to force them to break up. He can't bear a grudge against his grandmother, so he can only deal with you. Every word Yang Ruyu said was full of pearls of wisdom. Yang Shi felt her heart stab and her expression froze. Sister, I. As soon as she opened her mouth to speak, she was interrupted by Yang Ruyu. You haven't let him fall in love with you in the past 3 years. Now that woman is back, your situation will only become more difficult. I have found you a great divorce lawyer who specializes in marriage. If you lose your man, you can find another one, but if you lose your money, it's really gone. Yang Shi, wake up. I have something else to do at the company. I have to attend a social event later. I'm hanging up now. Yang Ruyu hung up the call without giving Yang Shi any chance to answer. Yang Shi sighed, put away her phone, rubbed her brows, and felt upset. But what Yang Ruyu said made sense, and she couldn't even find an excuse to refute it. She patted her cheeks to sober herself up a little and threw herself into her work. There are 2 more operations to be performed in the afternoon, and Yang Shi has to devote herself to it. Fortunately, the difficulty coefficients of the 2 operations today were not great. After Yang Shi came out of the operating table, the assistant handed her a bottle of special drink to replenish her body functions. Yang Shi waved her hand and refused. These refreshing drinks are not good for the fetus. She had thought it through. She wanted to keep the child, leaving the father behind while keeping the son. She walked slowly towards the office and saw Zhao Shuai sitting on a chair outside her office from a distance. She looked relaxed, and even though she was wearing a hospital gown, she didn't look sick at all. She seemed surprisingly full of energy. No wonder Yu Sighting likes her so much. When Zhao Shuai saw her, a smile immediately appeared on her face. She stood up from her chair and walked towards her with a slightly red cheek. She spoke somewhat embarrassedly. Dr. Yang, I have consulted other doctors before, and they all said that this surgery may affect my future fertility. You told Sighting earlier that you could guarantee that after the surgery was successful, I would have 2 babies in 3 years. Is that true? Chapter 9, What an enviable relationship. Yang Shi quietly looked at Zhao Shuai's face that was full of expectation, and slowly replied with 2 words. Fake. Zhao Shuai's expression froze for a moment, and she looked at Yang Shi with a subtle look. Then, after I have the surgery, will it be difficult for me to have children? Her voice was trembling and she looked very pitiful. If it was an ordinary patient, Yang Shi would have been able to offer some comfort at this time, but Zhao Shuai happened to be her love rival. Yang Shi looked at her calmly, with a calm tone. Nothing is absolute, so Miss Zhao, you have to be mentally prepared. After she finished speaking, she walked past Zhao Shuai and thought to herself that she was really not a good doctor. When Zhao Shuai heard that, her eyes turned red. She grabbed Yang Shi's arm and asked softly. Dr. Yang, do you dislike me? She just noticed it. Yang Shi stopped and looked at Zhao Shuai, forcing a professional fake smile. Of course not, Miss Zhao is my patient. As a doctor, I naturally take good care of my own patients. However, I will definitely try my best to preserve your uterus, so that you and Mr. Yu will have the opportunity to conceive the fruit of your love. Zhao Shuai bit her lip and looked at Yingxi cautiously, obviously not believing what she said. Yu Sighting didn't find anyone in Zhao Shuai's ward, so he came to Yangxi's office and heard these words. Looking at the bright smile on Yangxi's face, Yu Sighting's expression stiffened a little. A feeling of anger rose in his heart for no reason, and the look in his eyes when he looked at her became a little colder. Yangxi pursed her lips, saw the man's figure, smiled, and took Zhao Shuai's hand away from her arm. Miss Zhao, I'm very busy. If you don't have anything else to do, don't bother me. Go and bother your lover instead. Zhao Shuai followed Yangxi's gaze and saw Yu Sighting standing not far behind her. She smiled tenderly, turned around and walked to Yu Sighting, put her arm around his, and was extremely intimate. Didn't you say you were busy with company matters? Why are you here so early? Yu Sighting withdrew his gaze from Yangxi, lowered his eyes to look at Zhao Shuai who looked dependent on him. A subtle emotion flashed across his deep black eyes. I was worried you'd be bored, so I turned down an impromptu meeting. Zhao Shuai was touched. Although it is a bit boring to stay in the hospital, I still hope that you can come and accompany me after you have finished your work. Your grandmother didn't agree with us being together in the first place. I'm worried that if she knew about these things, she would blame me and stop us from being together. Zhao Shuai's voice was soft, and her words could not conceal her disappointment. Won't. When Yu Sighting raised his eyes, he saw Yangxi had already walked back to the ward. She never even glanced at them during the whole process. From her indifferent attitude, he suddenly realized that her ultimate purpose in maintaining this marriage was just for Yang's sake. He is the tool man. His face suddenly turned pale, and he looked in the direction of Yangxi's office with dark and gloomy eyes. Zhao Shuai noticed his mood change, looked up at him, and clenched her hands slightly at her sides. Sighting, what's wrong? Yu Sighting retracted his gaze and replied calmly, I'll take you back to the ward. Zhao Shuai didn't ask any more questions and followed him back to the ward obediently. The moment she lowered her head, a hint of viciousness flashed in her eyes. Old Mrs. Yu was not used to staying in the hospital and wanted to be discharged. After Yangxi finished her work, she took her back to the old house. She held her old man's hand and walked out of the elevator, talking and laughing. As soon as she walked out of the elevator, the old lady stopped. A hint of doubt flashed in Yangxi's eyes. She followed the old lady's gaze and saw Zhao Shuai holding Yu Sighting's arm with one hand and holding an apple in the other, eating while walking, looking relaxed and comfortable. Yu Sighting. Old Mrs. Yu's face immediately darkened. Zhao Shuai paused, holding the apple in her hand. Her expression changed several times, and she quickly threw the apple into the trash can on the side. Grandma Yu. Her voice was slightly worried and her expression was dazed. When old lady Yu saw her hand tightly holding Yu Sighting's arm, she almost died of anger. You shameless woman, do you know that he is married? Zhao Shuai's face turned pale, and she stood stiffly in place, looking at Yu Sighting in astonishment, her eyes full of confusion. Are you married? Her voice was already filled with tears and tears fell from her eyes like pearls. Yu Sighting did not answer, his brows furrowed. Yangxi stood quietly beside old lady Yu and looked up at the man in front of her. Really? His cold and sharp eyes fell on her, and his contemptuous expression seemed to be accusing Yangxi of being scheming. Obviously, he already felt that this meeting was a coincidence deliberately arranged by her. You go upstairs first. Yu Sighting took Zhao Shuai's hand away from his arm, and his tone was as gentle as jade, which made people feel warm. But this kind of warmth has never belonged to her. Zhao Shuai didn't want to leave. She looked at Yu Sighting with tears in her eyes, feeling very aggrieved. Sighting, are you really married? Her face was pale and she was wearing a hospital gown. She looked so weak and fragile that she seemed like she would faint at any moment. Old Mrs. Yu was filled with anger and was about to speak when she was interrupted by Yangxi. Grandma, there are too many people here, it's not a good influence. Old Mrs. Yu was a person who cared a lot about her reputation. Seeing people coming and going in the hospital, her expression froze for a moment and she glared at Yu Sighting. Come home with me right now. The old lady gave the order in a deep voice, and Yangxi supported her as she walked out of the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Yangxi breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, Mrs. Yu did not reveal in a hurry that she and Yu Sighting were husband and wife. Life for patients in the hospital is very boring, so rumors spread quickly. Yang Shi didn't want to come to the hospital early tomorrow morning and become the subject of everyone's after-dinner gossip. She helped the old lady into the car, but Yu Sighting had not come out of the hospital for a long time. Yang Shi withdrew her gaze from the window and gently tried to calm Mrs. Yu down. "Grandma, let's go back first. I believe Sighting will handle it." Old Madam Yu sighed, with a hint of blame in her tone. "You just trusted him too much, that's why Zhao Shuai had the opportunity to run up to you and take advantage of you." Yang Shi was silent. After everyone waited for a few minutes and saw that Yu Sighting did not come out, the old lady also told the driver to drive with a cold face. Yu Sighting returned from the hospital half an hour after returning to the Yu family's old house. The expression on his face was calm, and when he looked at Yang Shi, his deep black eyes were not as sharp as they had been in the hospital just now. It was obvious that he had calmed Zhao Shuai down, so she looked so relaxed. Yang Shi turned her gaze away from him, a hint of self-mockery flashing in her eyes. What an enviable feeling. Chapter 10, Not That Attractive Yet. When Mrs. Yu saw the person coming in from outside, she was furious and immediately shouted, "You still remember to come back?" Seeing her attitude, Yu Sighting was not annoyed. He glanced at Yang Shi, who was sitting on the sofa, and said, "I'll come and pick her up." Old Mrs. Yu took a deep breath, glared at him unhappily, reached out and took Yang Shi's hand, looking like she was willing to make the decision for Yang Shi. "Xiao Shi, if you don't want to go home tonight, you can stay at Grandma's place." Before Yang Shi opened her mouth to answer, she saw the man's dark eyes, which were as dark as ink and contained a hint of warning. If she agreed to stay here, it would be inconvenient for Yu Sighting to leave. Zhao Shuai is going to have surgery tomorrow, so he must go and accompany her tonight. "Grandmother." She pursed her red lips and spoke slowly, but before she could finish her words, Yu Sighting interrupted her. "She is very particular about her bed." Old Madam Yu frowned and said angrily, "Shut up." Yang Shi's eyebrows were light, and she responded softly, "Grandma, I am indeed a little picky about my bed, and I have a very important surgery tomorrow, so I can't make any mistakes. It's not convenient to live in the old house. You should rest early. Sighting and I will not disturb you." As she spoke, she slowly stood up from the sofa. Seeing this, old Mrs. Yu sighed softly, then stood up from the sofa, holding Yang Shi's hand tightly. She wanted to say something, but Yu Sighting had already stretched out his hand and tightly grasped Yang Shi's waist. With just a little force, he pulled Yang Shi away from her. "Grandma, we'll leave first. You should have a good rest." Yang Shi was pulled by him and fell into his arms. The faint fragrance on his body entered her nostrils and her heartbeat became irregular. Her delicate eyebrows were slightly furrowed, and after a few seconds, they relaxed again. Old Mrs. Yu was still brooding over what she had seen in the hospital today. She snorted coldly, turned her back and ignored Yu Sighting. Seeing this, Yang Shi tried to comfort the old lady with gentle words. "Grandma, please take good care of yourself. When I'm done with my busy schedule, I'll come back to the old house to accompany you. Don't be angry, okay?" Only then did old lady Yu turn around, take Yang Shi's hand and give her a few instructions. Yu Sighting never moved his hand away from the woman's waist. Her waist was thin and soft, just like the tone of her voice when she spoke to the old lady, which made people feel extremely comfortable. Walking out of the yard, Yang Shi saw that old Mrs. Yu had already entered the house, and Yu Sighting withdrew his hand from her waist at this time. It was obvious that the man's intimate behavior towards her just now was just a show for the old lady. Yang Shi suppressed a flash of disappointment in her heart and said, "I drove here myself." After she finished speaking, she was about to drive her own car, but Yu Sighting grabbed her hand and said, "I'll have my assistant drive you to the hospital tomorrow." Seeing that Yu Sighting seemed to have something to say to her, Yang Shi did not act pretentiously. She walked past Yu Sighting's passenger door, opened the back seat door, bent down, entered, and sat down. "Let us leave the co-pilot seat to Zhao Shuai." Yu Sighting looked at her actions, his eyes flickered slightly, and he glanced at the passenger seat, with a hint of displeasure in his eyes. "I'm your driver." Yang Shi paused, her eyes changed slightly, she was silent for a few seconds, and then said, "Then I will be your driver." Yu Sighting was silent. With a cold face, he got into the car, started the car, and drove away from the Yu family's old house. Along the way, neither of them spoke first to break the deadlock. Sanchi Park City. Yu Sighting drove the car into the yard and stopped. Yang Shi opened the door and got out first. Seeing that Yu Sighting had a cold face and had no intention of getting out, she bit her lips lightly and said something in a low voice. The old lady bumping into Miss Zhao in the hospital has nothing to do with me. Hearing their voice, Yuncheng raised his eyes and glanced at her. Their eyes met and Yang Shi did not dodge or evade. Seeing her calm and composed appearance, he retracted his gaze and said calmly, "It has nothing to do with you, but you were the one who brought her downstairs." Yang Shi felt a chill in her heart, secretly regretting that she had wasted her breath in front of him. She took a deep breath, withdrew her gaze from Yuncheng, turned around and went into their house. Yuncheng glanced at her back, started the car and backed it into the garage. As soon as Yang Shi stepped into the door, she heard the sound of the car restarting in the yard. She bit her lip lightly to calm herself down. She had expected that he would go to accompany Zhao Shuai, so there was nothing to be upset about. Aunt Lin saw Yang Shi coming back and hurried forward. "Madam, have you had your meal? Do you need me to prepare some midnight snack for you?" Yang Shi put her handbag on the cabinet and replied with a smile, "No, I ate at the old house first." Hearing this, Aunt Lin nodded slightly and glanced towards the door. Yang Shi noticed her gaze and said softly, "Grandma hasn't been in good health recently, Aunt Lin, don't bother her to worry about something harmless." Hearing this, Aunt Lin smiled awkwardly and nodded. When Yuncheng stepped into their house, he heard her gently instructing Aunt Lin. His narrow eyes narrowed slightly. She was so generous, but for some reason it made him feel irritated. Aunt Lin was the first to see Yuncheng enter the room. "Master!" she exclaimed in surprise, obviously not expecting Yuncheng to come back. Yang Shi's figure froze for a moment, and she glanced sideways at the man who stepped in from the door. Yuncheng looked at her slightly surprised expression and snorted, "Why, I can't come back yet." Yang Shi twitched the corners of her lips, revealing a very faint smile. "Of course not." Yuncheng glanced at Yang Shi, walked past her expressionlessly, got into the elevator, and went up to the second floor. Yang Shi looked up at Yuncheng as he walked out of the elevator and his tall figure walked towards the master bedroom, her expression changing slightly. She walked up the stairs to the second floor as usual. After entering the master bedroom, she was startled when she heard the sound of running water in the bathroom. Since that time last month, Yuncheng has never stepped into this bedroom again. He even took a shower when he came back tonight, and it was obvious that he wanted to stay here. She suppressed the throbbing in her heart, secretly cursing herself for being spineless, and when she turned around to leave the bedroom, the bathroom door opened. Yuncheng just wrapped a bath towel around his waist to cover his important parts. His exquisite mermaid lines were smooth and extended all their way to the mysterious area, and his chest muscles were clearly visible. For some reason, Lu Fangfei's words suddenly flashed through her mind, "Your husband looks like a man who is very good at it. He is really good at it." As she was thinking this in her mind, she raised her eyes and their gazes met Yuncheng's. She was stunned for a moment and avoided his gaze. Yuncheng looked at her tender red ears, paused for a moment while wiping her hair with a towel, lowered his eyes to glance at the bath towel between his legs, and reached out to lift it up slightly. That handsome face was slightly wary. Yang Shi realized the hidden meaning of his actions and became angry. "Don't worry, Mr. Yu. You are not that attractive to me." Chapter 11, Loss of Interest. Yuncheng's face darkened when he heard the voice. "Who is attractive to you then, Qin Shichen?" Yang Shi said calmly, "It's not you anyway." After she finished speaking, she turned and left the master bedroom. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room." As soon as she stepped out of the master bedroom, the man behind her grabbed her shoulder. There was a warmth in his broad palm. Yang Shi stopped and her heartbeat became stronger. Her entire ventricle felt a tingling and distended pain, which was extremely uncomfortable. "You?" His voice was low and slightly angry, and before he could finish his words, his cell phone vibrated. Yang Shi turned around and looked at him, but he withdrew his hand, picked up the phone on the counter, and walked to the balcony. After a while, his voice could be heard from outside the balcony. "Okay, I'll be right there." His voice was gentle, probably he was talking to Zhao Shuai. Zhao Shuai is going to have surgery tomorrow, so how could she not need him to be by her side tonight? She laughed at herself, and when she saw Yuncheng coming back from the balcony, she asked, "Miss Zhao asked you to go over and accompany her?" Yuncheng put away his phone, glanced at her expressionlessly, and did not respond. Yang Shi's smile faded slightly, and she added softly, "Miss Zhao is probably not in a good mood tonight. You should go over and comfort her. The patient's mood has a great impact on the outcome of the disease." As she finished her words, the man looked at her with dark eyes that turned colder, You are quite generous. Yang Shi smiled indifferently. Don't you men like such generous wives? Yu Siting had a cold face, with a hidden obscurity in his deep eyes, and walked towards the cloakroom. Yang Shi pursed her lips and turned to go to the guest room. Not long after, her sister called and said, the land held by the Yang family in the western suburbs was bought by Yu Siting at a high price. With his help, the land that the Yang family had previously held has been sold out. Yang Shi hummed softly. He really loved Zhao Shuai so much that he helped Yang in order to avoid any accidents during the operation. The debt crisis of Yang's company was temporarily resolved. Yang Ruyu talked with great interest about Yang's company's decision to get rid of real estate and lighten its load in the future. Yang Shi listened quietly. Perhaps because her topic did not receive any response, Yang Ruyu also lost interest. Forget it. You won't understand even if I tell you. Now that the Yang family crisis has been resolved, you and Yu Siting should also put your divorce on the agenda. After so many years, you may have developed feelings for a dog. Don't let yourself be wronged. Yang Shi did not respond. Yang Ruyu didn't say much and hung up the call directly. Yang Shi took a deep breath and heard footsteps outside, so she walked out of the guest room and saw Yu Siting walking into the elevator. The moment the elevator door closed, Yang Shi smiled slightly and said softly, Boss Yu, don't worry. We are husband and wife. I will do my best to perform Miss Zhao's surgery tomorrow and will not let you die without a family. The elevator door closed, and Yu Siting remained expressionless. After a while, the sound of a car engine leaving was heard outside. Yang Shi took a deep breath. There was a high probability that Yu Siting would not come back here tonight. She was familiar with her bed, so in order to get a better rest, she went back to their master bedroom. Maple Forest Villa. This is the leisure and entertainment venue set up by Ji Senya, and it is also the base for these good brothers who have grown up together. Ji Senya had just returned to China not long ago, and it was the first poker game organized by him, and there were 3 of them but one was missing. There was no reason for Yu Siting not to come. Seeing him come in, Ji Senya leaned slightly back in his seat. What about paying the public taxes at home? So slow. Yu Siting raised his eyebrows but did not answer. Lu Sang, who was standing by, listened to Ji Senya's words and smiled. He's about to get divorced, and he has no place to pay his public taxes. Yu Siting sat down expressionlessly and drew his cards. Zhou Wenyuan glanced at Yu Siting and mentioned it casually. I heard that Yang Ruyu is looking for a lawyer who is good at handling divorce cases recently. Did you know that? Yu Siting looked at the cards in front of him seriously and nodded slightly. I know. He looked nonchalant, and Ji Senya on the side couldn't help but remind him, Yang Shi is soft and cute, but her sister is not a pushover. You and Yang Shi didn't sign a prenuptial agreement when you got married, so be careful that they might rip you off. Yang Shijiao is soft and cute. How come he didn't know this side of his wife? Yu Siting played a card, looked sideways at Ji Senya, and replied nonchalantly, well, when Yang Ruyu skinned you before, everyone saw it. Ji Senya. Cow. Can we still have fun? Late at night. Yang Shi turned over and casually put her arms forward. She felt a warmth in her palms. She was stunned for a moment and touched it uncertainly, then her hand was held by a broad palm. Sleep well. The man's voice was hoarse and low. Yang Shi opened her eyes suddenly and saw that Yu Siting had returned here at some point and was lying on the bed. How, when did you come back? The wariness and alienation in her eyes made Yu Siting frown. Why, I can't come back. Yang Shi remained silent. Yu Siting had a cold face. He pulled her hand hard and pulled her into his arms. His dark eyes were filled with aggressive possessiveness. After Qin Shichen comes back, I won't even let you sleep in the same bed with me. Yang Shi. Seeing that she didn't answer or even explain, Yu Siting's face looked extremely ugly. After the card game, Ji Senya invited Yu Siting to have a couple of drinks. Ji Senya had been deeply hurt by Yang Ruyu in the past, so after a few drinks, they talked a lot about the 2 sisters. He was quite bothered by Ji Senya's words. It's normal for you and Yang Shi to divorce now that Qin Shichen has returned to China. His mind couldn't help but recall the time when he and Yang Shi had just gotten married and he asked Yang Shi why she wanted to marry him. How did Yang Shi respond at that time? Because you look like my type. It turns out that Yang Shi chose to marry him because she treated him as a substitute for Qin Shichen? An unknown anger burned in Yu Siting's heart. That day, Yang Shi and Qin Shicheng were talking at the hospital gate. The surprised look and bright smile on Yang Shi's face were indeed related to the 4 words, soft and cute. With a cold face, he leaned over and kissed Yang Shi's lips, passionately and domineeringly. Yang Shuan smelled a faint smell of alcohol and immediately turned her head to avoid his kiss. Have you been drinking? Yu Xiting frowned. Although he was unhappy, he still responded calmly, yeah, I had a drink. Yang Shi pursed her red lips, her eyes slightly pale, looking at him, and said calmly, alcohol can make the human brain excited. Are you sure you don't want to calm down? After all, if Miss Zhao knew, she might be sad. Yu Xiting. He pulled his hand back sullenly and let go of her, completely losing interest. Chapter 12. She wants to thank her in person. After leaving the warm embrace, Yang Shi felt cold and quickly got into the warm quilt, turned over and faced her back to the man. A tear rolled down from the corner of my eye, silently covered by the darkness. When Yang Shi woke up, the man beside her was gone. She hid the disappointment in her eyes, got up, washed, packed up simply, and went downstairs. Yu Xiting was sitting on the sofa in the living room. When he heard footsteps coming from upstairs, he looked up. Yang Shi was wearing a pair of light-colored jeans and a very simple white shirt. Her hair was tied into a ponytail behind her head, and her whole body exuded a youthful aura. She saw Yu Xiting, who was sitting on the sofa, paused slightly, but quickly returned to normal, smiling in his eyes, and took the initiative to greet him. Morning, Mr. Yu. Yu Xiting's eyes turned slightly cold when he heard her address him. Morning. His voice was cold and he lowered his eyes to continue reading the magazine in his hand. Aunt Lin had already prepared breakfast. Seeing Yang Shi coming downstairs, she quickly invited the two to have breakfast. Master, Madam, breakfast is ready. Yang Shi nodded slightly, stepped into the restaurant, pulled out a chair and sat down. Yu Xiting walked in expressionlessly and sat opposite Yang Shi. The two sat facing each other, and neither of them spoke. After breakfast, Yang Shi got up and was about to leave. Yu Xiting also put down his chopsticks and glanced at Yang Shi. Take my car. Yang Shi heard this and nodded in agreement. Okay. Her car was still at the old lady's place and the driver hadn't brought it back to her yet. Hospital. Zhao Shuai was waiting at the door of Yang Shi's office early in the morning. When she saw Yang Shi and Yu Xiting walking out of the elevator together, the expression on her face froze slightly. You guys came together. Yang Shi glanced at the man beside her calmly, and seeing that he didn't answer, she curled the corners of her lips and nodded. Yes. Her answer was clear and concise, and Yu Xiting immediately gave her a warning look. Boss, you picked me up specially. Ms. Zhao is so lucky to have President Yu care about you so much. Zhao Shuai's vigilant expression relaxed a little after hearing Yang Shi's words. Sai Ting and I are just ordinary friends. She was already ill and wearing a hospital gown. She spoke softly and gently, looking so fragile that people inexplicably felt a sense of pity for her. As a woman, Yang Shi couldn't help but be attracted by Zhao Shuai's morbid beauty, let alone Yu Xiting. She glanced at Yu Xiting beside her and saw that his brows were furrowed, and there was worry that could not be concealed in his eyes. Yang Shi smiled calmly and replied, I understand. Before, Zhao Shuai had always pretended to be Yu Xiting's girlfriend in front of her. But yesterday, his married identity was exposed, so naturally she could only claim to be friends. After all, being called a mistress when someone destroys someone else's marriage is not a nice thing to hear. Take Miss Zhao back to the ward to rest for a while. A nurse will come and take Miss Zhao to the operating table soon. Yang Shi glanced past Yu Xiting and walked into her office. When Zhao Shuai saw Yu Xiting's eyes fall on Yang Shi, her brows furrowed sharply. Sai Ting. Zhao Shuai gritted her teeth secretly and spoke softly. Yu Xiting then retracted his gaze and said, let's go back to the ward. Zhao Shuai nodded slightly and followed Yu Xiting back to the ward obediently. The operation lasted 5 hours. Yang Shi kept watching the surgical assistant suture the wound, and only left the operating table after making sure that all the data was correct. Everyone remained highly vigilant about this operation to ensure that it went smoothly. After all, everyone can see the relationship between Zhao Shuai and Yu Xiting. If she had an accident, I'm afraid the hospital would not be able to continue operating. Yang Shi left the operating room through the side door. When passing the door, she glanced outside through the small window. Yu Xiting was still sitting in the same position as when the operation started, his face solemn and with a hint of worry in his eyes. Yang Shi retracted her gaze and whispered to the assistant. Go and notify the family. The assistant nodded. Yang Shi cleaned up, put on her white coat again and returned to her office, feeling a little weak due to hunger. She picked up the water cup and took a sip of water, then looked at the time. She had another surgery in an hour. She sighed, took out a piece of bread from her bag, and planned to make do with it. Yu Sighting's tall figure appeared at the door. He looked at the woman who was chewing bread expressionlessly and frowned. Is this what you're eating for lunch? Yang Shi put down the bread in her hand and looked up at the man who had sat opposite her. There is another operation later. It's past mealtime in the cafeteria. It's a waste of time to eat outside. She answered naturally, glancing at the bread beside her while speaking, but still spoke to him patiently. Ms. Zhao's operation was very successful. She should take good rest during this period. After recovery, it will not affect her fertility. This is the most successful surgery I have ever performed. Yu Sighting hummed coldly without saying anything more. He glanced at her with an ambiguous look in his black eyes, then stood up and left. Yang Shi waited until he went out, then picked up the bread again. After eating it, she felt a little fuller. But she is pregnant now, and if she continues to live like this for a long time, the baby in her belly will definitely not get enough nutrition. She sighed, feeling inexplicably depressed. About 10 minutes later, Assistant Chen walked into Yang Shi's office carrying a basket. Ms. Yang, this is the dish that the banquet has just prepared. Mr. Yu said that you worked hard to perform surgery on Miss Zhao, so this is a reward for you. Xingyang was her favorite restaurant before she got married, and the food there was very much to her taste. After getting married, she went there less often, and now she hasn't been there for a long time. She reached out to take the basket that Assistant Chen handed over and said in a light voice, "Thank President Yu for me." Assistant Chen did not see any sadness on Yang Shi's face. He secretly breathed a sigh of relief, left respectfully, and went to report to Yu Sighting. Miss Yan accepted the basket and asked me to thank you on her behalf. Yu Sighting sat on the sofa with an expressionless face, nodding slightly, his deep black eyes showing no change of emotion. An hour later, Yang Shi started another operation. She went to prepare 20 minutes early. Zhao Shuai woke up and saw Yu Sighting still sitting on the sofa in her ward, and she felt slightly happy. Sighting. Her voice was extremely weak. Yu Sighting put down the documents in his hand and stood up. The operation was successful. You need to rest now and get well. Zhao Shuai nodded gently and forced out a pale smile. I also want to thank Dr. Yang. Sighting, please help me call Dr. Yang over. I want to thank her in person. Yu Sighting nodded slightly and did not refuse. He turned and left Zhao Shuai's ward and went to find Yang Shi. The door of Yang Shi's office was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and walked in. The first thing he saw was the basket containing their feast on the table. He walked over, opened the lid, and saw all the dishes were still intact in the basket. Chapter 13. She invited other men to watch a movie together. When Yang Shi came down from the operating table, the sky outside the window had already darkened. Both operations today took a long time. Considering the fetus in her belly, Yang Shi did not drink anything refreshing during the whole process. After getting off the operating table, she felt relaxed and extremely tired. She walked back to her office, took off her white coat and hung it on the hanger, took out her handbag from the cabinet at her feet and was about to leave. When she looked up, she saw Yu Sighting standing at the door with a sullen face. The man's face looked unhappy. Yang Shi raised her eyebrows slightly and asked, "Miss Zhao is not feeling well." As she spoke, she rubbed her brows, suppressed her tiredness, and went to Zhao Shuai's ward to check on her. After all, Zhao Shuai is her patient. She walked to the door, but Yu Sighting had no intention of moving to let her pass. Yang Shi was puzzled and looked up. Yu Sighting's deep black eyes looked at her calmly, his handsome face was expressionless and not showing much emotion. Yang Shi asked, "What's wrong?" Yu Sighting glanced at her slightly haggard face and replied coldly, "It's okay," he said, and turned and left. Yang Shi frowned, thinking that Yu Sighting was a little strange. She took a deep breath and calmed her emotions. Just then, the clinical nurse in charge of Zhao Shuai came over. Yang Shi asked a few questions and learned that Zhao Shuai had fallen asleep and was fine. Then she returned to the office, took her handbag and left. She was now tired and hungry, and just wanted to go back quickly, drink a sip of the hot soup prepared by Aunt Lin, and then have a good sleep. After walking out of the hospital gate, Yang Shi waited for a while but failed to get a taxi, so she took out her mobile phone and opened the online car-hailing platform. After placing the order, she found that the order was actually scheduled for half an hour later. She rubbed her eyebrows and then remembered that today was Valentine's Day and it would be difficult to get a taxi at this time. Unfortunately, she didn't drive here today. She had no choice but to open her address book and look for Lu Fangfei's number, hoping to get a ride back with her. As soon as she dialed the number, Qin Shicheng's voice came from afar. Xiaoxi. When Yang Shi heard his voice, her eyes lit up and she forced a smile. She was about to step towards Qin Shicheng when suddenly a black Maybach stopped in front of her, blocking her way. The window on the back seat slowly lowered, and Yu Sighting's handsome face appeared in front of her, with a rare murderous look hidden in his dark eyes. Get in the car. His voice was cold and emotionless, with an impatient command. Yang Shi paused, glanced at Qin Shicheng who was already walking over, and pursed her red lips. Someone is here to pick me up, so I won't bother Mr. Yu. Yu Sighting glanced at Yang Shi coldly and said lightly. Yang Shi, water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize it. The Yang family was not truly out of danger. Yang Shi paused and saw the hidden threat in the man's eyes. The man reached out and pushed open the back door. Yang Shi took a deep breath and bent down to get in the car. After Yang Shi got in the car, the back seat window slowly rose up. Qin Shicheng stopped when he saw Yang Shi got into Yu Sighting's car. The black Maybach slowly drove past him, and Qin Shicheng's gentle face also darkened a little. After a while, Yang Shi's cell phone rang. The man next to her glanced at her coldly and said, "Don't answer it." Yang Shi. The phone rang for a while and then fell silent. Normally it only takes about 20 minutes to get back to Park City from the hospital, but today I was stuck in traffic for half an hour. The man beside him looked increasingly impatient. The driver who was driving saw Yu Sighting's emotions from the rearview mirror and quickly explained. Today is Valentine's Day, so there is a lot of traffic at night. After hearing this, Yu Sighting glanced at the woman beside him. Although Yang Shi was sitting in the back seat with him, the distance between them was enough for one more person. She looked out the car window with gentle eyes. A young boy was holding a bouquet of flowers and confessing his love to a girl. The girl accepted the boy's confession and there was cheering all around. Yang Shi curled her lips, retracted her gaze, and turned sideways to see Yu Sighting tapping on the screen of his mobile phone, wondering who he was sending a message to. Looking at his focused eyes, she frowned slightly and her smile faded. After all these years of marriage, she has never received flowers from Yu Sighting. What a pity. The driver had been carefully observing the situation behind him. Seeing the two people looking at each other in silence, he whispered something. "Madam, don't you like watching movies? I happen to have 2 movie tickets. It's rare for the young master to have time. You two can go and watch it together. Let Yu Sighting go to the movies with her." Yang Shi imagined the boring scene and immediately shook her head. "I don't like it. I just want to go back and rest now. She is very tired." Yu Sighting's face immediately turned cold. Driver. When we returned to Park City, Aunt Lin hurried out to greet us. "The food is ready, master, madam, please go in and eat." As soon as Yang Shi got off work, she sent a message to Aunt Lin asking her to come back for dinner. She was already starving at this point, so she hurried into the restaurant. Yu Sighting glanced at Yang Shi's back calmly and replied solemnly, "I've eaten." Aunt Lin paused when she heard the voice, and looked at Yang Shi who was having a meal in the restaurant, her face full of heartache. Today is Valentine's Day, and Yu Sighting was probably having dinner with that woman. After Yang Shi had eaten and drunk her fill, she went upstairs contentedly. When she went upstairs, she glanced at the man sitting on the sofa. He was holding a mobile phone, tapping the screen with his slender and handsome fingers, and sending a message to someone. Only Zhao Shuai could make him reply to messages patiently while holding the phone. Her eyes darkened slightly and she walked upstairs. Yu Sighting heard footsteps and looked up, then his cell phone vibrated and he looked back. Assistant Chen sent a message on the screen. "Mr. Yu, I'm on my way to deliver the flowers." Yu Sighting thought about Yang Shi's attitude just now, frowned, and finally replied, "I'll send it over after you buy it." A few minutes later, Assistant Chen entered the living room holding a bouquet of flowers, his face full of respect and caution. "Boss Yu, these are the flowers you requested." Yu Sighting said coldly, "Put it down." Assistant Chen saw that he looked unhappy, so he quickly put the bouquet on the table, very respectfully. When I saw Yang Shi's envious eyes in the car, I got excited and sent a message to Assistant Chen to ask him to order a bouquet of flowers. Now that the flowers were delivered to him, he just felt inexplicably irritated. He tugged at his tie and asked Assistant Chen to leave first. Upon seeing this, Assistant Chen left. Upstairs. Yang Shi came out of the bathroom after washing up. She heard the sound of a car leaving outside and her expression was subtle. She picked up her cell phone, checked the time, and called Qin Shicheng back. After all, Qin Shicheng had helped her a lot before, so Yang Shi couldn't neglect him too much. The call was connected quickly. Yu Sighting went upstairs with a bouquet of flowers, and Yang Shi's extremely gentle voice came from the bedroom. I've been so busy lately that I didn't even know the movie was released today. Why don't we go and see it tomorrow? We happen to be free tomorrow. Last time you helped my family sell the land in the southern suburbs, I haven't thanked you yet, so please don't be polite to me. Outside the door, Yu Sighting tightened his grip around the bouquet and his face darkened. Chapter 14, There are things men can do but women can't. After Yang Shi finished her call with Qin Shicheng, she went to the balcony to get some fresh air. When she lowered her eyes, she caught a glimpse of Yu Sighting walking out of the yard. She quietly watched the man get into the car and drive away, with a hint of sarcasm on her lips. Are you really reluctant to let Zhao Shuer spend Valentine's Day alone in the hospital? She took a deep breath, her nose felt a little sore, and her eye sockets were swollen and numb. She bit her lip lightly, forcing down the bitter emotion, turned back into their house, took out her cell phone and called her sister. Sister, did you find the divorce lawyer you looked for last time? Her voice was very soft, and you couldn't tell much emotion from it, but her eyes were red and tears were falling from the corners of her eyes. Yang Ruyu was silent for a few seconds. I'll ask him to contact you tomorrow. Yang Shi hummed softly. Yang Ruyu didn't ask much, but just told her to go to bed early because she had to go to work tomorrow. After Yang Shi hung up the phone, she gradually broke down and couldn't help but shed tears. It would be great if she could be as tolerant as Yang Ruyu. But she couldn't let go. When Yu Sighting went to spend Valentine's Day with Zhao Shuer, she was so jealous that she even rushed up to stop him. But when she thought that even if she tried hard to keep him, his expression was always cold and his enthusiasm never belonged to her, Yang Shi felt disappointed. Yang has now escaped from the predicament, and this marriage can indeed end. After Aunt Lin had cleaned up everything in the kitchen, she brought the fruits to Yang Shi. As soon as she reached the door, she heard suppressed sobbing coming from the master bedroom. Aunt Lin paused as she was about to knock on the door and looked inside through the crack in the door. She saw Yang Shi hugging her knees with her hands, crying softly with her head down. Her shoulders were shaking, and it was obvious that she had been suppressing her emotions for a long time, and she let them out that night. Aunt Lin just saw Assistant Wang bringing flowers to Yu Sighting and thought that the relationship between them had eased a little. I didn't expect it to be the same. Aunt Lin sighed helplessly, did not go into the house to disturb Yang Shi, and turned and left. After Yang Shi had cried her heart out, she lay down on the bed and had a rare good sleep. She had a good sleep, and when she got up early in the morning and went into the bathroom to wash up, she found that her eyes were slightly swollen. She applied cold water to her eyes for a long time and put on some delicate eye makeup to cover her red and swollen eyes. Looking at himself in the mirror, who was in good spirits, he smiled, changed into a burgundy shirt with a sense of design, paired with a pair of black suit pants, and walked downstairs. When Aunt Lin saw Yang Shi coming downstairs, she immediately smiled and invited Yang Shi to have dinner. Madam, breakfast is ready. Yang Shi nodded slightly, walked to the dining chair and sat down. Her skin was already fair, and the red shirt she wore made her skin look even whiter than snow, making her whole body so white that it seemed to be glowing. Madam, you look really good today. Yang Shi smiled slightly, thank you. When she spoke, her eyebrows were curved and she seemed to be in a very good mood. If Aunt Lin hadn't seen Yang Shi hiding in her room crying last night, she would probably have thought that there was no problem with the relationship between her and Yu Sighting. The driver from the Yu family's old house had already delivered Yang Shi's car back last night. After having breakfast, Yang Shi drove to the hospital by herself. Inside the hospital, Yang Shi walked out of the elevator with a faint smile on her face and greeted the colleagues passing by. Everyone's eyes couldn't help but stay on Yang Shi for a while. Yang Shi is beautiful to begin with. She usually doesn't wear much makeup, which gives her a gentle and scholarly temperament. But at this moment, she has delicate makeup on her face, and she looks radiant. Her beauty also carries a strong aggressiveness, which gives people a bright impact. Dr. Yang, why are you so beautiful today? Are you in love? Yang Shi smiled slightly and did not give a direct answer. Yu Siting walked out of Zhao Shui's ward and saw the charming smile on Yang Shi's face. His face darkened. His deep black eyes fell on Yang Shi, and he looked at her without any reservation. A colleague saw Yu Siting looking at Yang Shi, so he signaled to Yang Shi with his eyes. Yang Shi turned sideways and saw Yu Siting standing not far from the door of Zhao Shui's ward. He was still wearing the same clothes he wore when he left yesterday. It was obvious that he stayed in the hospital with Zhao Shui all night last night. She hid the sadness in her eyes and forced a smile. Miss Zhao, are you okay? Yu Siting nodded slightly. Fine. Yang Shi nodded, pay more attention to rest. Her voice was light and her tone was normal. Yu Siting's eyes darkened slightly. Yang Shi withdrew her gaze from Yu Siting and walked towards the lockers while chatting with her colleagues. Yesterday, some colleagues heard some gossip about Yu Siting and wanted to find Yang Shi to find out the situation. But Yang Shi was on the operating table the whole day yesterday and was so busy that she could not be seen. Dr. Yang, you hit it so well. You are actually the adopted granddaughter of old Lady Yu. Why have I never heard you mention it before? It is no secret in the hospital that the behind-the-scenes boss of Jinshan Hospital is old Lady Yu. Yang Shi smiled gently and responded, didn't I ever say that? Maybe I forgot. Yang Shi has always focused on her work in the hospital. She is low-key and has never made enemies with others, so she has always been popular in the hospital. I heard that Mr. Yu is already married. Did you know about this a long time ago? Yang Shi smiled softly and nodded gently, yeah. The colleague was full of curiosity and asked quickly, Boss Yu is in such a state, but the young lady didn't come to tear the one in the ward apart. Isn't that too generous? A hint of embarrassment flashed across Yang Shi's eyes, maybe it's because there's no emotion. She said softly, and seeing her colleague's face full of curiosity, she quickly said, I have a surgical plan to submit and I have to do ward rounds, so I won't talk to you for now. She quickly put on her white coat and left the storage room. As soon as she walked to the office door, she saw Yu Siting sitting on the chair in her office, looking at her with a gloomy look in his eyes. Are you in love? Yang Shi. She walked to her seat and sat down, looking up at the man opposite her. Do you want me to have a relationship? Yu Siting said coldly, how dare you? Yang Shi raised her eyebrows, Boss Yu is really hypocritical, aren't you also in a relationship with Miss Zhao? Yu Siting frowned and looked at her sternly, Yang Shi, there are some things that men can do, but women can't. Yang Shi paused as she opened the drawer to take out the file. This isn't a feudal society. Why can men do this but women can't? Yu Siting looked at her indifferently and answered coldly. Equality between men and women. Yang Shi, I didn't expect you to be so naive. Yang Shi was choked by his words and fell silent. In today's society, although gender equality is advocated, there is no true equality. When men cheat, most people advise women to turn a blind eye. If a woman cheats, she will never be forgiven, and even her family will not be able to hold their heads up, and they will be nailed to the pillar of shame forever. So what Yu Siting said is very right, there are some things that men can do but women cannot. Chapter 15 He will never fall in love with her. Yang Shi raised her eyes and met his slightly sarcastic gaze. She paused for a moment and immediately looked away. Don't worry, Mr. Yu. Even if I want to have a relationship, I will wait until after my divorce to have a legitimate relationship. Her red lips curled slightly as she spoke, and she picked up the medical record on the table and started flipping through it. Mr. Yu, don't worry that I'll cheat on you, so if there's nothing else, I'll start working. She no longer looked at him, but her clear eyes were still gentle. Yu Siting's face immediately turned cold. Yang Shi has devoted all her attention to work and completely ignored him. His face froze, he stood up from his chair, glanced at her solemnly, and spoke condescendingly. Shuer wants to see you. Yang Shi raised her eyebrows, closed the medical record in her hand, and nodded. It just so happens that I also want to meet Miss Zhao. Yu Siting's face became even gloomier. Yang Shi curled her red lips slightly and said softly, Don't worry, Mr. Yu, I won't say anything nonsense in front of Miss Zhao. Yu Siting snorted coldly, turned around and left without answering. Seeing that he looked unhappy, Yang Shi's eyes flashed with confusion. She followed the man nonchalantly, and saw that he took big steps, as if he couldn't bear to see Zhao Shuer staying alone in the ward. She sighed, hiding the sadness in her heart. Zhao Shuai saw Yu Sighting walking in from the ward door and said in a very weak voice, "Sighting, I want to drink some water." Hearing their voice, Yu Sighting walked over, poured water for Zhao Shuai, and brought it to her lips. Zhao Shuai enjoyed Yu Sighting's care naturally. Yang Shi watched this scene quietly. She felt a pang in her heart, but her face remained calm and gentle. Miss Zhao seems to be in good spirits. Yang Shi spoke softly. Zhao Shuai then noticed Yang Shi standing at the door. A hint of shyness flashed in her eyes and she spoke softly. "Thanks to Sai Ting's care." Yang Shi nodded gently and looked at Yu Sighting with a smile. "Mr. Yu, you have worked hard." Yu Sighting remained silent, his cold eyes swept across her delicately made-up face, and a feeling of irritation rose in his heart. In the 3 years since they got married, he rarely saw Yang Shi dress herself up so carefully. Zhao Shuai saw the strong displeasure in Yu Sighting's eyes and pursed her bloodless lips slightly. "Sai Ting, you haven't been to the company today, right? Why don't you go to the company to handle your business first? I have a nurse here to take care of me, so nothing will go wrong." After hearing what Zhao Shuai said, Yu Sighting lowered his eyes to glance at the time and responded, "Good. Then I'll go back to the company first. Call me if you have anything." Zhao Shuai nodded slightly and watched Yu Sighting leave. After Yu Sighting walked out of the ward, he heard Zhao Shuai asking Yang Shi in a soft voice, and his pace unconsciously slowed down. "Dr. Yang, do you have an important appointment today? You are dressed so beautifully." Yang Shi was looking down at the sutures on Zhao Shuai's wound, and she replied calmly, "I'm going to watch a movie with my friends tonight." Zhao Shuai smiled and looked at Yang Shi with an ambiguous expression. Then this friend must be very important to Dr. Yang. Yang Shi responded lightly with a hum and was perfunctory. She didn't want to chat with Zhao Shuai. Outside the door, Yu Sighting heard Yang Shi's answer, raised his hand and tugged at his tie, with a look of displeasure in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. After Yang Shi checked Zhao Shuai's wound, she reminded her, "Resist more during this period, and try not to touch the wound when wiping your body. If it's not convenient for you, you can ask Mr. Yu to help you." As she spoke, her eyes fell on Zhao Shuai. Zhao Shuai smiled slightly, her face a little pale, and nodded gently. Her expression and movements were very natural. "Good." She agreed readily. Yang Shi was startled and felt a little uncomfortable. Judging from Zhao Shuai's behavior, it is obvious that she has already had any intimate contact with Yu Sighting. Otherwise, she wouldn't have answered so naturally and agreed so readily. She looked away, feeling somewhat regretful that she shouldn't have tried to test him just now. She was just asking for trouble. "You should have a good rest. If you have any questions, you can come to me or your attending nurse." Yang Shi covered Zhao Shuai with the quilt and was about to leave. Zhao Shuai, however, called her with hesitation. "Dr. Yang, do you know Sai Ting's wife?" The atmosphere became tense for a moment. Yang Shi stopped and was silent for a few seconds, then asked in a low voice, "Do you want to see her?" Zhao Shuai shook her head and pursed her lips slightly, looking weak and innocent. "Who am I to see her? I just want to know what kind of person she is." Sai Ting said that they were just married for a marriage and there was no relationship between them. Sai Ting assured me that he would never fall in love with her. Yang Shi had a subtle look on her face when she heard this. Zhao Shuai bit her lip lightly, with a hint of hesitation and entanglement in her tone. "Although I have always been confident about Sai Ting's feelings for me, they have been married for 3 years after all. I wonder if my appearance has hurt her." Yang Shi was silent. Zhao Shuai sighed softly, looked out the window, tears streaming down her eyes. "Sai Ting and I have been dating for many years, but Grandma Yu has never recognized me. I wanted to stand by Sai Ting so much and let everyone know that I was worthy of him, so I chose to study abroad, just to be worthy of him one day. I heard that he is a rich lady, born with a golden key. For someone like me who was born in an ordinary family, no matter how hard I try, I will never be worthy of him in this life." Yang Shi just felt her heart was blocked. She glanced at Zhao Shuai and said in a calm voice, "Ms. Zhao, the most important thing for you now is to take good care of your body." Zhao Shuai seemed not to have heard what Yang Shi said, and said in a very low voice, "Actually, I always wonder, what did I do wrong in this relationship between Sai Ting and me? It's obvious that Sai Ting and I love each other, and I was the one who met Sai Ting first, so why am I the third party that everyone hates and destroys their marriage? Shouldn't she be the one who destroyed the relationship between Sai Ting and me?" Zhao Shuai's resentful gaze fell on Yang Shi. Yang Shi paused for a moment, her heart seemed to be twisted by a huge hand, it hurt so much that even breathing became difficult for her. She frowned slightly, looked at Zhao Shuai's sickly face, took a deep breath, and after a long time, she finally squeezed out a sentence. I heard they are already discussing divorce. Boss Yu likes you so much, he will never let you suffer any injustice or bear these insults for no reason. Zhao Shuai's eyes were red and she looked at Yingxi with great pity. Really? Chapter 16 The one who bullied her was Yu Sighting. Zhao Shuai's eyes were full of anticipation. Yang Shi felt anxious and nodded, really. They were just a marriage, there was no love involved. Divorce is inevitable. She tried her best to keep her tone calm, and after she finished speaking, she walked out of Zhao Shuai's ward. Zhao Shuai looked at Yang Shi's leaving back, her eyes slightly gloomy, with a hint of ambiguous emotion in them. After Yang Shi left Zhao Shuai's ward, hurried footsteps were heard from the next ward. Yang Shi turned her head and saw the nurse pushing an old lady with cancer out of the ward next door. The old lady was too old, and the cancer had caused many complications, so she suddenly fell ill. Yang Shi put away all her negative emotions and followed the nurse to push the old lady into the emergency room. After several hours of rescue, the old lady ultimately could not be saved. When she passed away, she reached out and held Yang Shi's hand, with a hint of comfort in her weak eyes. It seemed like he was telling Yang Shi not to feel guilty. This old lady had been hospitalized for a long time and had been fighting cancer for many years. She was one of the first patients Yang Shi took over. She was optimistic and cheerful, and had a good relationship with most of the medical staff in the hospital. Yang Shi saw the old lady's hands hanging down, took a deep breath, controlled her emotions, left the emergency room, and allowed the patient's family to enter the emergency room to see the old lady for the last time. Listening to the crying of family members coming from the emergency room, Yang Shi endured the discomfort and returned to her office. She felt so upset that all her negative emotions burst out at that moment. She took out her cell phone from the drawer and called Yang Ruyu with trembling hands. Sister, that lawyer didn't contact me. Yang Ruyu said calmly, that lawyer is a coward. When he heard that he was going to file for divorce with Yu Sighting, he simply didn't dare to take the business. I'm still looking for a lawyer for you. Yang Shi bit her lip and uttered, softly. Yang Ruyu heard something wrong in Yang Shi's tone and asked, what's wrong? Did Yu Sighting bully you? Yang Shi listened to Yang Ruyu's concerned tone and tears fell from her eyes. Sister, I regret it. Her voice was filled with suppressed tears. Yang Ruyu was silent for a long time. When Yang Shi got married, the Yang family was still at its peak and a very prominent and famous family in Yuncheng. However, the Yu group was torn apart due to internal family strife. Old Mrs. Yu was a shrewd person. She got the news from somewhere that Yang Shi was interested in Yu Sighting, so she went to propose marriage. Her father had always admired Yu Sighting, and since Yang Shi was also interested, he agreed to the marriage. Yang Ruyu had warned Yang Shi at the time that if she wanted to get married, she should marry a man who loved her, and never try to warm the heart of a man who didn't love her. However, Yang Shi said that even if she could not warm Yu Sighting's heart, she would never regret it, not in her entire life. It had only been 3 years, and Yang Shi, who had made such a solemn promise at the beginning, now cried and told her that she regretted it. Yang Ruyu was in mixed feelings. On any other day, she might have scolded Yang Shi, but at this moment, she didn't have the heart to reprimand this sister who had never suffered any grievances since childhood. If you regret it, go home. If you hit a wall, turn back. The Yang family is not so poor that they can't support you. After listening to Yang Ruyu's words, Yang Shi could no longer hold back her tears. She hung up the phone in a hurry, laid on the table, and sobbed. A colleague passed by Yang Shi's office and heard the news that the lovely old lady had passed away. Although everyone in the hospital is used to seeing life and death, no one would feel good when someone actually lost vital signs under their noses. None of her colleagues entered Yang Shi's office to comfort her. After all, she had to deal with this kind of emotion by herself. After a while, the phone in Yang Shi's office rang. She immediately calmed herself down and picked up the phone to answer it. Hello, I'm Yang Shi. Her voice was a little hoarse, and she tried her best to control her crying. Hello, Dr. Yang, we are in the Department of Critical Care Medicine. Your father has woken up and wants to see you. Hearing this, Yang Shi paused, immediately wiped away her tears, and hurriedly spoke. Thank you, I'll be right up. Yang Shi went to the locker to touch up her makeup and make sure there was nothing unusual. Then she hurried to find her father. Her father's condition has now stabilized. When Yangshi went upstairs, the doctor in the intensive care unit mentioned to her that her father could be transferred to the general ward later. Yangshi expressed her gratitude and entered her father's ward. As soon as she walked to the door and pushed it open, she saw Yuncheng sitting beside her father's bed, chatting with her father. She paused for a moment, then stepped through the door, and her father immediately smiled. "Xiaoxi, you are here." Yangshi nodded, stepped forward, reached out and held her father's hand, and sat directly on the hospital bed. "Dad, you've been scaring me to death lately." There was a hint of crying in her voice. Yang's father immediately apologized and said that his behavior was indeed too impulsive. Her father had been successful all his life, but suddenly failed in middle age. He could not accept this outcome for a while. "Saiting just told me that your sister saved the company. Your sister is now able to handle all the company's affairs on her own, but you are the one that worries me the most." As Father Yang spoke, he reached out and rubbed Yangshi's head. Yangshi snorted, "Since you can't let me go, then don't do anything stupid. Without you backing me up, won't anyone be able to bully me in the future?" When Yangshi said this, her eyes couldn't help but turn red. In order to hide her emotions, she fell down and leaned her head on her father's arm so that her father wouldn't see her emotions. Yuncheng sat quietly on one side, looking at her seriously. Father Yang stroked Yangshi's back, comforted her a few words, and said with a smile, "You're already married, but you're still acting like a child. Isn't that a joke for Saiting? Besides, you're Saiting's wife now. Who dares to bully you?" Yangshi was silent. The person who bullied her was Yuncheng. She noticed that Yuncheng was looking at her, so she gritted her teeth, glanced at him, and looked away. Yuncheng raised his eyebrows slightly and his eyes darkened. After a while, medical staff came to help Yang's father move to another ward. Yangshi and Yuncheng stayed with him in the new ward for a while. Father Yang glanced at the clock and said, "It's getting late. You and Saiting still have work tomorrow, so go back first." The Yang family's nanny also hurriedly said at this time, "Second miss, I will take good care of Mr. Yang, you and your uncle can go back without worry." "Okay, then I'll trouble Aunt Wang to help us take care of my father." Yuncheng had just sent her a message saying that he was waiting for her downstairs in the hospital, so she was in a hurry to leave. However, Yuncheng beside her was not in a hurry at all. Seeing her turn around to leave, he naturally reached out and put his arm around her waist, pulled her back to his side, and said to Yang's father with a gentle expression, "I had someone send some of Dad's favorite dishes to the hospital. I have some free time today, so I'll have a meal with you and talk." Father Yang was delighted when he heard this and agreed, "Okay, I haven't had a meal with you guys for a long time." Chapter 17 can easily lead to unnecessary misunderstandings. Yangshi didn't expect Yuncheng to actually suggest having dinner with her father in the ward. She looked at Yuncheng with confusion. Yuncheng glanced at her with a normal expression and spoke gently. "Xiaoxi shouldn't have any other plans today, right?" Yangshi paused for a moment when she heard the voice, and inexplicably had the illusion that Yuncheng had arranged it this way on purpose. She secretly took a deep breath. Ever since the incident at Yang's, her father's face had not shown such a happy expression for a long time. So naturally she couldn't bear to spoil her father's interest. "No." She forced a smile and tried to remain calm. Yuncheng narrowed his narrow eyes, smiled, and sat on the sofa at one side. Father Yang was in a very good mood and talked with Yuncheng about many business issues. Yangshi didn't understand what they were talking about and looked confused. She took out her cell phone and sent a message to Yuncheng to apologize. Yuncheng immediately said that accompanying her father was more important. His considerate attitude made Yangshi feel very guilty. After all, she was the one who took the initiative to make an appointment with others, and now she broke the appointment, so she always felt a little guilty. When Yuncheng was chatting with Yang's father, he caught a glimpse of Yangshi typing on her phone the whole time, and he didn't know who she was chatting with. His eyes were slightly cold and he put his arm around Yangshi's waist. In front of her father, Yangshi did not resist, but still kept her head down and fiddled with her phone. Yuncheng chatted with Yang's father as usual, but he applied a little force on the hand that was pinching Yangshi's waist. Yangshi felt pain and looked up at Yuncheng. "You?" She gritted her teeth secretly, and when she thought that this was her father's ward, she immediately felt confident. "Why are you pinching me?" Yuncheng frowned frivolously, glanced at the phone that she was holding tightly in her hand, and said something in a sad tone. My dad and I were chatting, but you were playing with your phone. Isn't that a bit disrespectful to your two dearest men? Kindness. His voice was deep and sexy, with a hint of seduction. If she didn't know their current marital status very clearly, Yangshi would almost think that she and Yuncheng were a loving couple. She bit her lip secretly and remained silent. Father Yang smiled softly, looking at Yangshi's obedient face, and said, "You are still the same, girl. If your sister goes out to discuss business, she will just play with her phone. I am afraid that the customer will run away long ago. Only if you marry Sai Ting can you do whatever you want. If you were someone else, you would have to learn even if you don't want to enter the business world." Yangshi pursed her lips and glared at Yuncheng to express her dissatisfaction. He was clearly acting in front of her father on purpose. Yuncheng looked at her, smiled, and tightened his arms around her waist. The Yu family's business does not need Xiao's efforts. She likes to be a doctor, and the Yu family will fully support her. Yangshi was silent. The Yu family has never had any objections to her work. It was indeed for Yangshi that old lady Yu bought Jinshan Hospital. Father Yang listened to Yuncheng's words and nodded with satisfaction. He originally thought that the marriage relationship between Yangshi and Yuncheng was very cold, but now it seems that this is not entirely the case. The restaurant quickly delivered the dishes to their hospital and also sent a folding table. During the meal, Father Yang was in a very good mood and talked to Yuncheng for a long time. Yuncheng was extremely patient throughout the whole process. After dinner, Yangshi helped Aunt Wang clean up. When they went to throw away the garbage, Aunt Wang smiled and said to Yangshi, "Miss, it seems that the uncle doesn't care about you at all. For someone as noble as him to be able to eat with you and chat with you in the hospital, he must really like you enough to do this. Love the house and love the dog." When Yangshi heard this word, a hint of discomfort flashed across her eyes. She knew very well that Yuncheng did not love her. Yangshi did not answer Aunt Wang's words, but just smiled faintly and remained silent. When Yangshi returned to her father's ward, she saw Qin Shicheng at the door and was stunned. Qin Shicheng walked into Yang's father's ward with a fruit basket in his hand and greeted him with a smile. "Uncle Yang." When Father Yang saw Qin Shicheng, there was a hint of surprise in his eyes and he almost didn't recognize him. "You are Shicheng." Qin Shicheng nodded, glanced at Yuncheng who was sitting on the sofa on the side, and answered with a smile. "Yes, Uncle Yang, long time no see. I heard from Yangshi that you haven't been feeling well lately, so I came to see you. I haven't seen you for many years, and you are still the same, handsome and handsome." Father Yang couldn't help but smile and said, "You have changed a lot. From the young and immature boy at the beginning, he has become the calm and kind person now. Now the world belongs to you young people. I am already old." Yangshi stepped into her father's ward and her eyes first fell on Yuncheng. Yuncheng sat on the sofa, playing with the wedding ring on his ring finger. His expression was indifferent and he didn't show much emotion. When Father Yang saw Yangshi coming in, he hurriedly spoke to Qin Shicheng. "Oh, I forgot to introduce this to you. This is..." Qin Shicheng didn't wait for Yang's father to finish speaking. He immediately turned his gaze to Yuncheng and interrupted Yang's father. "Boss Yu, we met a few days ago." Father Yang was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, "Oh, so I've seen it before. Then I guess Xiaoxi has already introduced her to you." Yuncheng raised his head and his eyes met Yangshi's. There was a hint of amusement and mischief in his deep black eyes. "Have you introduced me?" Yangshi glanced at him and turned sideways to look at Qin Shicheng. "Have you had dinner yet?" Qin Shicheng shook his head and said with a smile, "I had an appointment with someone, but he stood me up, so I came up to see Uncle Yang." When Yangshi heard their voice, a hint of embarrassment flashed across her eyes. Yuncheng sat on the sofa, his expression much colder. Qin Shicheng smiled warmly, "I was just kidding you, I have a dinner appointment and I'm going to attend it later." After he said that, he turned sideways and looked at Yang's father. "Uncle Yang, I will come to see you another day. I have an important dinner to attend today." Father Yang nodded, only feeling that the atmosphere between the three young men was a little subtle. Thinking of how Yangshi and Qin Shicheng were inseparable in the past, Yang's father did not try to keep Qin Shicheng. After all, Yangshi was married now, which could easily cause misunderstandings. "Okay, take your time." Qin Shicheng left Yang's father's ward with a polite look on his face. Yangshi felt guilty, so she said something in a low voice. "I send you." Qin Shicheng did not refuse. Yu Sighting's eyes became even colder. Father Yang was about to call Yang Shi, but Yang Shi had already walked out. He saw that Yu Sighting's face was not looking good, so he helped to explain. Yang Shi and Yuncheng grew up together and have a good relationship, but they are just friends. Sighting, please don't misunderstand. Yu Sighting had no expression on his face and nodded sullenly. Xiaoxi is my wife, so I naturally trust her. Father Yan paused. It was clear that Yu Sighting did not look displeased, but for some reason, the temperature around him seemed to have dropped a lot. Chapter 18. He was kicked out. I'm so sorry, we haven't had dinner with my father in such a long time. He's not in a good mood today, so. Yang Shi explained softly. Qin Shicheng had a smile on his face, as gentle as jade. Fine. Uncle Yang is the most important. Besides, I suddenly received an important dinner invitation. It's a coincidence. Otherwise, I might have thrown you into the cinema. After hearing this, Yang Shi felt a lot less burdened. After watching Qin Shicheng's car leave, Yang Shi turned around and went back to the hospital. As soon as she reached the elevator door, it opened. Yu Sighting stood in the elevator with a sullen face, holding her handbag in his hand, his eyes slightly cold. Your father is resting. He reached out and stuffed the handbag into Yang Shi's hand, then walked past her. As they passed by, his low and contemptuous voice rang out. You haven't told Qin Shicheng that we're married yet. Yang Shi paused and bit her lips secretly. We're getting divorced soon anyway, so there's no need to tell her. Yu Sighting frowned, stopped, and a nameless anger rose in his heart. You want a divorce? Yang Shi nodded gently, yes. Boss Yu, let's get a divorce. Her expression was calm as water. As she spoke, she slightly turned to look at him, her eyebrows and eyes were gentle and her look was relieved. We didn't sign a prenuptial agreement when we got married, so I will entrust the division of property to a lawyer. Yu Sighting smiled coldly, are you not planning to leave the house? Yang Shi pursed her lips and smiled warmly. She has to get one of the money and the person, right? Now that she can't get it in person, she must have money. After all, there will be many other things to spend money on for the baby in your belly in the future. If Yu Sighting marries Zhao Shuer in the future, he will definitely ignore the children she gives birth to. Boss Yu, I was too naive before. I want to be more materialistic now. Yang Shi smiled faintly, slung her handbag over her shoulder and walked away. She had only taken 2 steps when Yu Sighting grabbed her arm. His grip was so strong that she felt like her bones were about to be broken. She frowned and looked at the handsome man. Boss Yu, anything else? Yu Sighting looked at her coldly, and the strength in his hands gradually loosened. Divorce is fine. You can go and negotiate with Grandma. After he finished speaking, he pulled his hand back and put his hands in his pockets with a cold expression. Yang Shi paused, and looking at his indifferent expression, she felt a little uncomfortable. The moment he grabbed her just now, Yang Shi thought that Yu Sighting wanted to keep her. It turned out that he was just afraid that the old lady would get sick from being angry. Good. Yu Sighting's face darkened a little, and his deep black eyes were filled with a hint of hidden hostility. She has just recovered a little, Yang Shi, you'd better think it over carefully. If she falls ill again, I will not forgive you. Yang Shi pursed her lips, I have a way with Grandma, you don't have to worry. Yu Sighting. He was speechless for a moment, turned around and left with a sullen face. Yang Shi suppressed the soreness in the corners of her eyes, turned around, headed for the parking garage, and drove back to Park City. This villa was the wedding house bought by the Yu family when she and Yu Sighting got married, and it is now registered under Yang Shi's name. Yang Shi has lived here for 3 years and has gotten used to it, so she wants to stay in this villa. Enter the house. Yang Shi looked at the men's daily necessities placed in the master bedroom, pursed her lips, found a paper box from the storage room, and packed all of Yu Sighting's daily necessities into the box. Aunt Lin heard the noise upstairs and walked upstairs. She was stunned when she saw Yang Shi packing things. She immediately turned around and went downstairs to call Yu Sighting. Master, did you have a quarrel with the young mistress? The young lady is packing up to move out now. Yu Sighting didn't answer and hung up the phone directly. Aunt Lin was stunned for a moment, then went upstairs again and hurried over to hold Yang Shi's hand. Madam, where are you moving to? You and the young master. Before Aunt Lin finished her words, she saw Yang Shi packing some men's products. She was stunned, her face full of confusion. Yang Shi smiled slightly, her expression very calm. Aunt Lin, Yu Sighting and I are planning to divorce, and this house is under my name. He may not come over in the future, so I packed up his things and sent them to him. Aunt Lin's face was full of tension. Wasn't he fine yesterday? Aunt Lin knew best about the seemingly harmonious but spiritually estranged marriage between Yang Shi and Yu Sighting, and she fell silent when she heard this. Grandma is not in good health. I will talk to her myself. As Yang Shi spoke, she stood up to take the clothes that Yu Sighting had hung in the cloakroom. Aunt Lin quickly followed and helped Yang Shi clean up. Young madam, don't worry, I will talk to the old lady. Yang Shi nodded and smiled faintly, thank you. A few minutes later, Yu Sighting rushed back to Park City. He walked upstairs with a cold face, saw the packed boxes at the door of the master bedroom, and walked in with a cold face. Yang Shi, why are you going crazy in the middle of the night? Yang Shi was still packing his suit jacket in her hand, and inside the room, all his personal belongings were packed up. All of Yang Shi's clothes were placed intact in their original places. Yu Sighting. Aunt Lin quickly explained, Master, I'm sorry, I misread it. The things that the young lady packed were not her own, but yours. Yu Sighting said coldly, I have eyes. When Aunt Lin saw the anger on his face, she immediately lowered her head and became respectful. Yang Shi pursed her red lips and said, Aunt Lin, please go downstairs first. Aunt Lin nodded and quickly walked out of this dangerous place. Yu Sighting reached out and snatched his coat from Yang Shi's hand and hung it back in its place. He stared at Yang Shi solemnly, his tone somewhat cold. You haven't even received your divorce certificate yet, but you're so impatient to pack up my things and move out. Who are you trying to make room for? Yang Shi raised an eyebrow and spoke in a light tone. I thought you might not come back during the time we were discussing the divorce, so first. Yu Sighting interrupted her, is it that I don't want to come back, or do you not want me to come back? Yang Shi. That's not what I meant. Yu Sighting had a cold face and smiled contemptuously. No, what do you mean? Yang Shi was still wearing the red shirt. Standing under the light, her snow-white skin was as white as jade. She didn't answer, but just looked at him quietly. The man's Adam's apple rolled slightly, and his deep black eyes narrowed slightly. After several seconds, he smiled contemptuously, turned around and walked out of the cloakroom. His eyes became much colder. As he walked, he took out his cell phone and called Assistant Chen. Come over to Park City and move my stuff. Assistant Chen did not dare to delay and arrived at Park City 10 minutes later. Looking at the packed boxes, he did not dare to ask more questions and quickly asked others to move the things into the car. After all the things were moved, Yu Sighting stood up from the sofa with a cold face and no expression, not even giving Yang Shi a glance. When Assistant Chen saw Yu Sighting coming out, he quickly opened the car door. The man got into the car with a sullen face, irritably pulled off his tie and threw it aside. Assistant Chen was so shocked when he saw this that he didn't even dare to breathe. It was obvious that Yu Sighting was kicked out by Yang Shi. Chapter 19. Doesn't she love you to death and refuse to divorce you? Assistant Chen carefully glanced at the rear-view mirror inside the car and saw Yu Sighting leaning slightly on the back seat. His cold black eyes glanced out the window, then he retracted his gaze and closed his eyes to rest. He quickly regained his composure. His previous irritability was only short-lived. Boss Yu, are these things going to be moved to Jiangyu Pearl? Yu Sighting opened his eyes and said, lightly, without much emotion in his voice. In the Park City. Aunt Lin looked at Yang Shi's increasingly red eyes, and seemed to be hesitant to speak. Yang Shi noticed Aunt Lin's pitying look, smiled slightly, and pretended to be strong. Aunt Lin, I'm fine. You should go to bed early. Aunt Lin nodded and sighed softly, young madam, you should also go upstairs and rest early. After she finished speaking, she returned to her servant's room. Yang Shi was the only one left in the huge living room. Tears quickly rolled down her eyes. She quickly wiped them with her hands, turned around, went upstairs and returned to the bedroom. In the room, all of Yu Sighting's things were taken away, leaving only Yang Shi's belongings. Looking at the room that suddenly lacked a lot of things, Yang Shi couldn't help but bite the corner of her lips, controlled her emotions, and went into the bathroom to wash up. The next morning, Yang Shi woke up, put on some delicate makeup to cover up her haggardness, went downstairs and went to the hospital. When Yang Shi went to Zhao Shuai's ward for rounds, Yu Sighting was not there, but there was a familiar faint fragrance in the ward. Her eyes immediately locked onto the incense on the counter, and her eyes darkened. Zhao Shuai followed Yang Shi's gaze with a smile on her face. I told Sai Ting yesterday that the smell in the ward was a bit unpleasant, so Sai Ting asked Assistant Chen to bring me some aromatherapy today. Yang Shi raised her eyebrows and answered naturally. This tastes good. Zhao Shuai's eyes lit up, as if she had found a topic to talk about, and she said enthusiastically, "Do you think so too?" When I first smelled this scent, I thought it was very suitable for Sai Ting, so I bought it for him as a birthday present. I didn't expect that after I've been abroad for so many years, Sai Ting is still using this aromatherapy. Yang Shi frowned as she listened to what Zhao Shuai said. When the light fragrance hit her nose again, she felt her stomach churning violently. She resisted the urge to retch. Zhao Shuai saw that Yang Shi looked unhappy, paused, and asked with concern. "Dr. Yang, what's wrong with you? Are you feeling unwell?" Yang Shi replied calmly, "It's nothing. I haven't had regular meals these past 2 days and my stomach is a little uncomfortable." As she finished speaking, she had already completed the physical examination for Zhao Shuai, turned around and said a few words to the attending nurse beside her, then hurriedly left Zhao Shuai's ward. As she reached the door, she almost bumped into Yu Sighting, who was walking towards her. Yang Shi stopped abruptly to avoid falling into the man's arms. Yu Sighting looked down at her with an expressionless face. The faint fragrance from his body hit Yang Shi, and she couldn't help but dry heave. Yu Sighting stared at her with a cold face. Yang Shi felt very uncomfortable. She pushed Yu Sighting away and strode back to her office. Inside the ward, the attending nurse and Zhao Shuai both heard Yang Shi's movements. Zhao Shuai clenched her hands slightly on the side of the bed. Dr. Yang seems to be feeling very uncomfortable. After the nurse recorded Zhao Shuai's temperature, she said something as if it was normal. Irregular diet can easily cause stomach cramps. Most doctors in our hospital have this problem. Besides, Dr. Yang has a lot of patients and often has no time to eat when he is busy. Zhao Shuai's expression relaxed a little when she heard the voice. But the next second, she saw Yu Sighting turn around and walk in the direction Yang Shi left, and she couldn't help but clench her clenched hands again. Yang Shi returned to the office and took a long time to calm herself down. She sat back in her office chair and looked up to see Yu Sighting standing at the door. The man glanced at her and walked in, without much emotion in his deep black eyes. "Better." Yang Shi paused when she heard the voice and replied calmly. "Better." Yu Sighting smiled coldly, "I'm asking about Zhao Shuai." Yang Shi was stunned for a moment, gritted her teeth secretly, and said, "I am also talking about Miss Zhao's situation." Yu Sighting sneered, "There are some disputes over the ownership of the piece of land in the western suburbs of the Yang family. Didn't your sister tell you?" Yang Shi frowned, not understanding why Yu Sighting suddenly told her about the Yang family. Seeing her confused look, Yu Sighting looked away, stopped talking, and stood up to leave. Seeing this, Yang Shi immediately stood up and chased after him. "What happened to that piece of land?" Yu Sighting lowered his eyes and glanced at Yang Shi's hand that was holding his arm. People were coming and going in the corridor, and everyone's eyes were looking in their direction. Yang Shi took a deep breath and pulled her hand back. Yu Sighting did not answer and walked to Zhao Shuai's ward. Yang Shi was about to turn around and go back to the ward when Lu Fangfei came over and said, "Yang Shi, I have a patient here whose condition is a bit complicated. Can you come over and help me take a look?" "Good." Yang Shi took a deep breath, collected her thoughts and returned to her work. After she finished her work, she returned to her office. When she passed by Zhao Shuai's ward, she saw Yu Sighting helping Zhao Shuai get out of bed. She quickened her pace and was about to leave, but she heard Yu Sighting's low and pleading voice from inside the ward. "Yang Shi." Yang Shi frowned, gritted her teeth, and stopped. "Is there anything wrong, Mr. Yu?" Yu Sighting looked at Yang Shi solemnly and said expressionlessly, "She wants to relieve herself." Yang Shi frowned, "Where's the nurse?" Zhao Shuai looked a little embarrassed. She looked at Yang Shi and then at Yu Sighting and said softly, "Sai Ting, it's okay, I can do it myself." At this time, a sarcastic voice rang out in the ward, "Helping patients solve their problems, isn't that your principle as medical staff?" Only then did Yang Shi realize that there were other people in Zhao Shuai's ward besides Yu Sighting and Zhao Shuai. She glanced indifferently at the man sitting on the sofa with a mocking and provocative smile. Yang Shi knew him, Yu Sighting's good friend, Yu. He and Yu Sighting are good friends and also love rivals. He has liked Zhao Shuai for many years. When Zhao Shuai went abroad, Yu followed Zhao Shuai abroad. Yang Shi's eyes turned slightly cold. She put the pen in her pocket and walked over. Zhao Shuai's expression became even more embarrassed. Dr. Yang, no need, I can do it myself. Yang Shi replied calmly, it's okay. As she spoke, she reached out and took Zhao Shuai's arm from Yu Siting's hand, and helped her to the bathroom. Just at this moment, Zhao Shuai's caregiver came back, and she hurried forward to help Zhao Shuai from Yang Shi's arms. He wanted to say something, but Yu Siting gave him a sharp look, so he moved his lips but said nothing. The bathroom door was closed, and Yang Shi looked at Yu Siting indifferently. Boss Yu wants to humiliate me, but there is no need to do so. To me, Miss Zhao is just an ordinary patient. This is too trivial. After she finished speaking, she glanced at He Yu with a disdainful expression. I know the rules of being a doctor better than you do. She turned away with a sullen look on her face. He Yu sat on the sofa, stunned for a while, then whispered something to Yu Siting. Doesn't she love you to death and refuse to divorce? Why does your attitude now seem like you don't love each other to death? Chapter 20. Don't answer Xiao Cheng's calls from now on. Yu Siting glanced over coldly and He Yu remained silent. After a while, Zhao Shuai came out of the bathroom, and the nurse beside her supported her carefully. The nurse saw that Yu Siting looked unhappy and was about to explain. You don't have to come tomorrow. The man's tone was cold and without any emotion. The nurse paused. Zhao Shuai quickly defended. I think this auntie took good care of me. Siting, don't be angry, the auntie has already apologized to me. She just went to answer a phone call. Before she finished her words, Yu Siting lowered his eyes and glanced at his watch with a sullen face. I'm going to the company. Assistant Shen will send you another nurse later. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned and left. Zhao Shuai stood there, her face full of sadness and a grieved look. He Yu, who was sitting on the sofa, raised his eyebrows slightly. He has always been like this. It's not the first day you've known this. What's there to be wronged about? Zhao Shuai took a deep breath and lay back on the bed with the help of the nurse. He Yu, you should go to work too. He Yu snorted lightly, but he had no intention of staying here any longer, so he stood up and left. When he walked out of Zhao Shuai's ward, he saw Yang Shi standing not far away and talking to the patient. Her eyes were gentle and she communicated with the patient's family very patiently. She had delicate makeup on her face and her skin was very fair. He Yu couldn't help but take a few more glances at her. Yang Shi noticed He Yu's gaze and looked over. He Yu put his hands in his trouser pockets with a ruffian look on his face. When he saw her looking at him, he looked away and walked away whistling. Yang Shi also withdrew her gaze and continued talking to the patient's family. She didn't have a good impression of He Yu. Ever since she could remember, she thought He Yu was annoying. After get off work. As soon as Yang Shi got in the car, she called Yang Ruyu. Yang Ruyu answered the phone, hurriedly said, I'm busy, and hung up. Yang Shi bit her lip lightly, feeling nervous. She drove directly to Yang Group and saw a police car parked in front of the gate. She frowned, immediately pulled the car over and entered Yang's. It just so happened that her sister came out of Yang's with the investigators. Yang Shi was stunned for a few seconds when she saw Yang Ruyu, then she hurried over and said, Sister. When Yang Ruyu saw Yang Shi coming, she frowned slightly, her expression as fierce as usual. Don't be nervous, I'm fine, I'm just cooperating with the investigation. After she finished speaking, she glanced at the assistant on the side, and the assistant immediately came over and pulled Yang Shi over. Second miss, it's okay, there are just some misunderstandings. Yang Shi frowned and immediately asked, what misunderstanding? The assistant took a deep breath and spoke in a low voice. It's just that the ownership of the land in the western suburbs is a little controversial. Director Yang has already invested in purchasing the land, but some procedures have not been completed yet. The Xiao family has now come out and said that the land belongs to them. The Gu family paid to buy the land from the Yang family, but they cannot use it. The Gu family asked the eldest lady to refund the money, but some time ago, the Yang family was in need of money. Although the money arrived at the Yang family, it was soon used to fill the deficit. Now that the Yang family is undergoing transformation, it will certainly not be able to return the money to the Gu family all at once. The assistant looked embarrassed and said softly, Yang's company couldn't refund the money, so the Gu family reported it to the police, saying that the eldest lady was committing fraud. Yang Shi frowned. Gu family. Didn't you sell that piece of land to the Yu family? The assistant's tone gradually became lighter. It was President Yu who recommended the Gu family to buy this land. Yang Shi took a deep breath and tightened her grip on the handbag. She knew nothing about the twists and turns of business, and at this moment she felt that Yang Ruyu seemed to have fallen into some kind of trap. When Ji Senya broke up with Yang Ruyu, it was a very unpleasant experience. He would definitely take this opportunity to severely suppress her sister. Second miss, you go back first. We will find a way to get the eldest lady out. Yang Shi rubbed her brows, her heart churning. While the assistant was speaking, he glanced sideways and saw a black Maybach slowly stopping on the side of the road. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be a car from the Yu group. Second miss, President Yu. He reminded softly. Yang Shi looked over and saw her cell phone ringing. She pursed her lips and picked up the phone to answer it. Yu Sighting's emotionless voice came, "Come here, let's go back to the old house for dinner." Yang Shi took a deep breath, hung up the phone, and said calmly to the assistant beside her, "I'll go back first." After she finished speaking, she walked towards where Yu Sighting was. The Yang group has not yet successfully transformed, and Yang still needs to rely on the power of the Yu family. If this matter is related to Yu Sighting, then he is warning her to face reality. Yang Shi took a deep breath and walked over. Assistant Chen immediately opened the back door. Yang Shi pursed her lips, bent down and got into the car. Yu Sighting sat in the car, raising his hand slightly to adjust his cuffs. Yang Shi pursed her lips and reached out to help him tidy up. Did you deliberately recommend the piece of land in the western suburbs to Ji Senya to buy? Her voice was very soft. After she straightened his sleeves for him, she stared straight at him with her clear almond eyes. Yu Sighting curled his lips slightly and nodded. Don't you want me to help Yang? Senya has money, and your sister has land, so it's the best of both worlds. Yang Shi took a deep breath. You know that Ji Senya. Yu Sighting interrupted her without waiting for her to finish her words. It was your sister's fault for selling the disputed land to Senya. Yang Shi looked at Yu Sighting intently. Just as she was about to ask him to help rescue Yang Ruyu, her cell phone rang. When she saw the caller ID, she frowned slightly and answered the call. Xiao Cheng's voice came from the other end of the phone. 1111 tilde. He called her in a particularly intimate way, and Yang Shi couldn't help but frown slightly. The man sitting next to her also had a dark look in his eyes. I'm Xiao Cheng. Yang Shi tightened her grip on the phone slightly. I know. The other party chuckled, his tone teasing. I heard that your sister was taken away? Ji Senya is really heartless. But it doesn't matter. My feelings for your sister have never changed. Just tell your sister that if she is willing to marry me, the piece of land in the western suburbs that belongs to the Xiao family will be considered as my gift to her. Yang Shi frowned. Why don't you go and talk to my sister yourself? You don't dare, do you? Xiao Cheng was silent for a few seconds, then smiled awkwardly. I dare to marry her, but I don't dare to say these words in front of her. 1111, you underestimate me. Yang Shi was silent. Xiao Cheng's joking voice sounded again. If I can't marry your sister, it's the same if I marry you. I heard you were leaving soon. Before Xiao Cheng could finish his words, Yang Shi's cell phone was taken away by the man next to him. He took the phone with a cold face, hung up the call directly, blacklisted Xiao Cheng's number, then threw the phone on the seat and spoke coldly to Assistant Chen who was sitting in front of him. Go and bail Yang Ruyu out. After he said that, he glared at Yang Shi angrily. Don't answer Xiao Cheng's calls anymore. Chapter 21. He is peeking at her. Yang Shi looked at the phone thrown beside her, took a deep breath, picked up the phone and put it in her bag. She was also unwilling to answer Xiao Cheng's call. But she didn't expect Yu Sighting to help her suddenly. Good. She answered straightforwardly. Yu Sighting's deep black eyes fell on her and he smiled coldly. Having gained the advantage, she suddenly became obedient. Taking his eyes away from her, the man's cold voice sounded. After the old lady was discharged from the hospital, she caught a cold again. During this time, we were asked to stay in the old house to accompany her. Yang Shi was stunned for a moment, and was about to speak when the man said something again in a deep voice. Yang Shi, the old lady has always been nice to you. Yang Shi pursed her lips, knowing what he meant, and glanced out the window. Don't worry, I will wait until the old lady gets better before I tell her about the divorce. Yu Sighting had a cold face. On their way back, neither of them spoke. When they arrived at the Yu family's old house, Yang Shi was the first to open the car door and get out. After getting out of the car, she immediately looked at Assistant Chen. Assistant Chen, I'm sorry to trouble you with my sister's matter. Thank you. Yu Sighting bent down and got out of the car. Listening to her polite tone, he frowned and a hint of displeasure flashed in his eyes. Assistant Chen noticed Yu Sighting's dissatisfied look, smiled awkwardly, and said quickly, "It's not a bother at all. I'm just following Mr. Yu's instructions." He didn't dare to take away the credit from Yu Sighting. Yang Shi raised her eyes to look at Yu Sighting, but before she could say thank you, the man came over and naturally put his arm around her waist. "Come in." As he spoke, he pulled her into his arms with a little effort. Her waist was so thin and soft that it seemed as if he could break it with just a little force. He frowned and said solemnly, "From today on, eat on time, otherwise when you leave the Yu family, others will think that our Yu family abuses you and doesn't give you food." Yang Shi entered the old house. When the housekeeper saw Yang Shi and Yu Sighting coming back together, he came over to greet them with a smile on his face. "The old lady has been talking about this for quite some time, and she's been looking forward to your return." Yang Shi smiled faintly and stepped into the living room. The old lady was sitting in a recliner. When she saw Yang Shi and Yu Sighting enter the room, she stood up and was about to come over. However, as soon as she stood up, she seemed to remember something and lay down again. "Xiao Shi, you're back." Yang Shi nodded slightly, walked over to the seat next to the old lady and sat down. The old lady immediately reached out and held Yang Shi's hand. "I have been feeling unwell recently, so I was thinking of asking you and Sighting to move to the old house temporarily to keep me company. When I feel better, you and Sighting can go back to Park City." While the old lady was speaking, she coughed twice violently. Yang Shi quickly stroked the back of her hand. The old lady coughed for a long time before she was able to control it. Yang Shi saw that her current state did not seem to be pretended, and a hint of hesitation flashed in her eyes. Seeing Yang Shi hadn't answered yet, the old lady looked at Yang Shi expectantly and added softly, "Is it okay?" Yang Shi raised her eyes slightly and looked at the man sitting on the sofa on the other side. He was sitting close to the bed, and the afterglow of the setting sun shone on his body, as if it were coated with a layer of gold. His deep black eyes looked at her leisurely, as if all this had nothing to do with him. Under the old lady's eager gaze, Yang Shi finally nodded. "Good." The old lady was very satisfied with Yang Shi's answer, and her whole mental state seemed to improve. Yu Sighting picked up a book from the bookshelf on the side and started flipping through it. They hadn't come back to have dinner with the old lady for a long time. After dinner, the old lady was in a much better mood and took Yang Shi to chat. Yu Sighting sat on the other side, listening to their conversation. "I heard your father woke up. Your father had an accident, and I haven't visited him yet. When I feel better, I will go to see him." As soon as the old lady finished speaking, without waiting for Yang Shi to speak, she directed her criticism at Yu Sighting. "Sighting, have you ever visited your father-in-law?" Yu Sighting leaned back slightly on the sofa and replied, "I have. I even had a meal with him in the hospital." Old Mrs. Yu immediately asked Yang Shi for confirmation. Yang Shi nodded slightly. After a while, Yu Sighting's cell phone rang. Yang Shi raised her head almost immediately and set her gaze on Yu Sighting. At this time in the past, Yu Sighting would probably have been in the hospital accompanying Zhao Shuer. Before the night was over, Zhao Shuer would naturally call and ask about his whereabouts. Yu Sighting noticed Yang Shi's gaze, picked up his phone, took a look, and replied, "It's a call from the company." After that, he got up from the sofa and walked to the balcony to answer the call. Yang Shi paused as she listened to Yu Sighting's explanation. Old Mrs. Yu held Yang Shi's hand tightly and spoke quickly. "Xiao Shi, Grandma knows you want to divorce Sighting. For Grandma's sake, give Sighting a chance. 3 months. After 3 months, if Sighting is still unclear with that woman, you can consider divorce, okay?" Yang Shi raised her eyes to look at the man who was on the balcony making a phone call. He had a lit cigarette in his hand, holding it between his fingers, with a cold look on his face. While he was talking, he suddenly turned his head to look inside the house. His eyes met Yang Shi's. He paused and almost immediately threw away the cigarette in his hand. Yang Shi has never liked the smell of cigarettes. When old lady Yu saw Yang Shi looking at Yu Sighting, she also glanced over and glared at Yu Sighting fiercely. Yang Shi pursed her lips and finally replied, "Grandma, then 3 months." Old Madam Yu was excited and held Yang Shi's hand tightly. "Okay." Yu Sighting ended the call and returned to the living room. Old Mrs. Yu's mood was obviously much better than before. Yuncheng raised his eyebrows and glanced at Yangshi. She had a gentle smile on her face, and she was smiling almost the entire time she was talking to the old lady. Yuncheng couldn't help but look at it a few more times. The two women sat together and seemed to have endless topics to talk about. After Yuncheng went upstairs to wash up, he returned to the bedroom and saw that Yangshi had not come upstairs yet, so he went to look for her. Seeing that old lady Yu was sharing interesting stories from her youth with Yangshi smiled particularly brightly. Yuncheng held the railing with one hand and looked for a long time. A servant passing by saw Yuncheng looking downstairs and asked softly, "Master, what are you looking at?" Yuncheng retracted his gaze, his expression calm as water. "The potted plants in the house can be replaced," he said, and walked back to the bedroom. "The gardener came and replaced all the potted plants yesterday. Do they need to change them again?" The servant looked puzzled and followed Yuncheng's gaze. He was stunned for a moment when he saw Yangshi's bright and smiling face. "You can't see the potted plant at all from this angle. It's obvious that the young master is peeking at the young mistress." Chapter 22. Yangshi, it's such a waste to wear this pajamas on you. After taking the medicine, old Mrs. Yu felt a little sleepy. The servant helped the old lady back to her room, and Yangshi went upstairs. When the servant saw Yangshi coming upstairs with a smile on her face, she hurriedly spoke. "Young madam, we have prepared your pajamas for you. They are in the cloakroom." Yangshi heard the voice and nodded. When I entered the bedroom, Yuncheng had already taken a shower and was sitting on the bed, playing with his mobile phone. Seeing Yangshi enter the room, he looked up at her and said, "I have adjusted the water temperature for you." After he finished speaking, he continued to look at his phone, tapping his fingers on the screen, as if he was replying to a message. Yangshi withdrew her gaze and went into the cloakroom to get her pajamas. There are many styles of pajamas prepared by the servants, but they all have one thing in common: they are very short. Yangshi picked out a slightly longer style of pajamas from all the styles. Although this red pajamas is slightly longer than other styles, the entire back is empty. She rubbed her eyebrows and chose to show her back over showing her legs. She took her pajamas and went into the bathroom. After Yuncheng replied to Assistant Chen's message, he put his phone aside and stared at the bathroom door. When he went into the cloakroom to get his pajamas just now, he had already discovered the pajamas style that the people at the old house had prepared for Yangshi. Every piece is sexy. Each piece was a style that Yangshi had never worn before. He was inexplicably looking forward to it. When Yangshi came out, she put her hands in front of her chest somewhat awkwardly. She hadn't noticed just now that this pajamas was not only backless, but also a deep V style. She had never worn this style of pajamas before, and she looked a little unnatural at the moment. She looked at the bed with a somewhat unnatural look, but Yuncheng, who had just been sitting on the bed playing with his mobile phone, was no longer in the room. She looked at the place where Yuncheng had just lain, feeling mixed emotions. Just as she was about to look away, she saw a man in a bathrobe, standing at the balcony door, looking at her. The red nightgown she was wearing made her skin look very white. The bathroom behind her was filled with mist, which seemed to cast a soft light filter on Yangshi. Yuncheng looked at her deeply, his Adam's apple rolling slightly. "Thought I was gone." Yangshi pursed her lips, trying to control her uncomfortable emotions. She wiped her hair, walked to the dressing table and sat down without answering the man. Yuncheng raised his eyebrows. The person who was very talkative in front of old lady Yu just now became like a taciturn person in front of him. He frowned, walked over, took the towel from Yangshi's hand, and wiped her hair. Yangshi was stunned for a moment, looking at the man's focused expression in the dressing mirror, and her heartbeat suddenly accelerated. Yuncheng noticed Yangshi's puzzled look and replied calmly. "Don't get me wrong, you're blowing my hair too slowly. It'll affect my rest. I have an important meeting tomorrow morning." Yangshi was silent. She just let Yuncheng blow her hair. She promised old lady Yu that she would give Yuncheng 3 months. How could the facts that had not changed in 3 years change in 3 months? Although I already know the final result, I still have a glimmer of anticipation. 3 months later, the baby in her belly was more than 4 months old. Her child may not have the company of his father in the future, so these few months can be considered as making up for it. Yuncheng's movements were gentle, and when he was blowing her hair, not a single strand of hair got tangled. His movements were skillful, as if he often blow dry women's hair. Only his fingertips would occasionally brush across the skin on Yangshi's back. Every time of his unintentional touch, Yang Shi couldn't help but tense her nerves and felt wonderful. The man didn't put down the hair dryer until Yang Shi's hair was completely dry. Yang Shi reached out and touched her hair, then said, "It's dry." Only then did Yu Sighting turn off the hair dryer and said, softly. He added with a hoarse voice, "Go to bed." He said, and turned to go to bed. Yang Shi pursed her lips slightly. Even though they had slept in the same bed for 3 years, her heartbeat was speeding up at this moment, as if she was newlywed. She controlled her emotions and climbed onto the bed from the other side, lifted the quilt and quickly lay down in it. She lay straight on the bed, looking up at the ceiling. Yu Sighting looked at her stiff defensive state and smiled coldly. "Yang Shi, it's such a waste to wear this pajamas on you." Yang Shi paused, glanced sideways at the man next to her, and seeing his slightly sarcastic eyes, she felt a stab in her heart and attacked almost immediately. "How about I take it off and you give it to Miss Zhao tomorrow?" When Yu Sighting heard the voice, his face immediately darkened. Yang Shi looked at his suddenly angry eyes, slowly withdrew her gaze, turned over, turned her back to the man, and her behavior became calm again. She didn't know what she was so nervously looking forward to just now. Yu Sighting looked at her smooth and white back, frowned, and his eyes deepened slightly. He just stretched out his hand to catch her in his arms, but the next second, Yang Shi reached out and turned off the light, and the room fell into darkness. In the dim environment, the man's extremely gloomy face could not be seen. The next morning, the biological clock woke Yang Shi up on time. She opened her eyes and found herself hugging Yu Sighting tightly. She was stunned for a moment. "Woke up?" The man's low, slightly suppressed, hoarse voice sounded. Yang Shi immediately pulled her hand back and looked up at Yu Sighting. The man's deep black eyes fell on her and kept going down. Yang Shi was stunned for a moment, lowered her head, and immediately raised her hand to block it. The next second, the man grabbed her hand, pressed it upwards, and leaned down. His actions were a bit rough, and Yang Shi was startled and her expression immediately became tense. "Yu Sighting." Yu Sighting looked at her deeply and covered her lips to prevent her from speaking. It is not suitable to do strenuous exercise during the first 3 months of pregnancy. Besides, she has a heavy workload during this period, and the fetus is unstable. If Yu Sighting held her hand very tightly, and Yang Shi was unable to pull her hand free. Yu Sighting's actions were reckless, and Yang Shi was so anxious that she burst into tears. Yu Sighting kissed her tears, paused, and all movement stopped. After a long while, he raised his head and stared at her. Seeing that she was crying, Yu Sighting gritted his teeth. "Yang Shi, we haven't divorced yet." Yang Shi was silent. Looking at her silent tears, Yu Sighting felt as if a bucket of cold water was poured over his head, and his voice was slightly frustrated. "Okay, I won't touch you." After he calmed down, he threw back the quilt, got up, and went into the bathroom. Soon, the sound of running water was heard. Yang Shi quickly wiped away her tears, stood up and changed her clothes. When Yu Sighting walked out of the bathroom, his expression became much colder. He glanced at Yang Shi indifferently without saying a word, walked past her, left the bedroom and went downstairs. The little incident just now seemed as if it had never happened. Chapter 23. Treat him as a driver. Yang Shi stood there looking at Yu Sighting's back, her eyes faded, and she went into the bathroom. When she finished washing and came out, she saw the servant standing at the door of their bedroom with a respectful and polite smile on his face. "Madam, I'll clean your room." Yang Shi nodded gently, "Thank you for your hard work." Upon hearing this, the servant quickly responded politely, "This is all my job." Yang Shi said no more and walked out of the bedroom. After taking a few steps, she stopped, turned to look at the servant, and spoke softly. "Please remove the aromatherapy in the room." When the servant heard this, there was a puzzled expression on his face. This type of fragrance was the one Yang Shi had specified before, and this type of fragrance is used in the new house. The old lady knew that Yang Shi liked this aromatherapy, so she asked people to use it in the old house as well. What flavor should it be changed to? Yang Shi hesitated for a while, and couldn't think of any good smell for the time being, so she said lightly, "I don't really like the smell of any aromatherapy lately, so there's no need to decorate our room." There wasn't much emotion in her expression when she spoke. The servant didn't ask any further questions after hearing this. He nodded and started to change the bed sheets for Yang Shi and the others. When she changed the sheets, her eyes involuntarily glanced towards the trash can. There was no garbage in the trash can, not even a piece of paper. Obviously, nothing happened between Yuncheng and Yang Shi last night. Yang Shi's pajamas were neatly folded on the sofa on the side. The expression on the servant's face was very subtle. Yang Shi walked downstairs and saw Yuncheng sitting on the sofa reading a magazine. He crossed his legs naturally. When he heard her coming down the stairs, he raised his eyes and glanced at her, just a faint glance without any words. The old lady had already gotten up and was exercising in the yard. When she heard the housekeeper say that Yang Shi had come downstairs, she walked into the house. Yang Shi saw that the old lady looked much better than yesterday, so she walked over and supported her. "Grandma, you seem to be in much better spirits today than yesterday." Hearing this, old lady Yu coughed lightly and said with a smile, "Yes, it is a little better, but I still feel very uncomfortable in my heart." The old lady said this simply because she was worried that they would leave the old house and would not be willing to stay here and live with her. A hint of helplessness flashed across Yang Shi's eyes, and she whispered an instruction. "You still need to pay more attention to rest." The cook from the kitchen brought breakfast to the table and came over. "Old lady, young lady, breakfast is ready." Old Mrs. Yu nodded, reached out and took Yang Shi's hand and walked towards the restaurant. Yang Shi glanced at Yuncheng, who had just put down the magazine in his hand and stood up. The eyes of their two people collided in the air. This time, before Yang Shi looked away, he was the first to look away. Yang Shi sat next to old lady Yu, while Yuncheng sat opposite them. During the meal, no one spoke, and everyone ate breakfast in silence. At this time, the maid who was cleaning the bedroom came in from outside, walked to the old lady's side, leaned close to her ear, and said something. The old lady nodded and asked the servant to leave. There were only 3 of them left in the restaurant. Yang Shi was drinking milk from a cup. She glanced and saw the old lady looking at Yuncheng, who was sitting opposite her, with a strange look in her eyes. Yuncheng was stared at by the old lady, his expression remained unchanged and he put down the spoon in his hand. "What else do you want to say?" Hearing this, old lady Yu sneered, "I'll ask a Chinese doctor to come and see you some other day." With a beautiful bride in her arms, nothing happened between Yuncheng and Yang Shi last night, which even old lady Yu found unbelievable. If it wasn't that Yuncheng had great self-control, then there must be something wrong with the health of her eldest grandson. After all, Yang Shi and he have been married for 3 years, and Yang Shi's belly has been flat for these 3 years. Yang Shi has a physical checkup every year and there is absolutely nothing wrong with her health. So there is only one possibility, that is, there is something wrong with Yuncheng's body. Yuncheng didn't understand and glanced at Yang Shi. "Isn't there a ready-made doctor at home?" Yang Shi raised her eyebrows and put down the cup. "Grandma, what happened to Sai Ting?" Old Mrs. Yu glared at Yuncheng, then looked at Yang Shi with a gentle expression. "Xiao Shi, do you like the pajamas that Grandma asked someone to prepare for you?" The styles of those pajamas were very sexy. Yang Shi had a general understanding of what was going on when she heard it. A blush appeared on her cheeks, and she felt a little embarrassed. "Grandma, this is not Sai Ting's problem," Yang Shi said softly, not daring to look up at the man opposite her. Yuncheng had a sullen face, leaning back in his chair with a cold gaze. Old Mrs. Yu snorted. "If it's not his problem, then how could it be your problem? You've been married for 3 years and there's been no movement in your belly. That's his problem." Yang Shi pursed her lips slightly, feeling inexplicably guilty. Yuncheng said coldly, "Xiao Shi knows best whether I have any problems or not. Grandma, please don't get involved. It's a waste for her to wear those pajamas. Have them all changed this afternoon." After he finished speaking, he stood up from his chair and left the restaurant. Yang Shi looked calm, having long been accustomed to his attitude. Old Mrs. Yu was so angry at him that her face became stiff and ugly. "You little brat. You don't have any appreciation skills at all." Yang Shi comforted the old lady gently. "Grandma, those pajamas really don't fit me very well." She was interrupted by the old lady before she could finish her words. "Xiao Shi, don't listen to that brat's nonsense. Those clothes are very suitable for you. Look at you, you have such a good figure. It would be a waste to hide them. When Grandma was young, there weren't so many styles of pajamas. Now I can't wear them even if I want to." Yang Shi was amused by the old lady's words. Yuncheng stood in the living room, lowered his eyes to glance at his watch, listened to the voices of Yang Shi and old lady Yu talking and laughing in the restaurant, and then thought of Yang Shi's completely different attitude towards him in the morning, and his heart sank. Hurry her up. He glanced at the servant beside him with a sullen face. Upon hearing the noise, the servant hurried into the restaurant to inform them. When Yang Shi came out of the restaurant, Yu Sighting was no longer in the living room. There was the sound of a car engine in the yard. After Yang Shi said goodbye to the old lady, she walked out of the house and saw Yu Sighting sitting in the driver's seat, holding the steering wheel with one hand and talking on the phone. He saw her coming out, and she raised her long, beautiful fingers and waved, looking a little anxious. Seeing this, Yang Shi quickened her pace, opened the back door, bent down and got in the car. Yu Sighting frowned slightly, glanced at Yang Shi who had already taken her seat in the rearview mirror. His expression turned cold. He started the car and left. She didn't even want to sit in the passenger seat, and she really treated him as the driver. Chapter 24. What is their relationship? All their way to the hospital, the two of them did not communicate at all. There were a lot of messages posted in the work group, most of which were about work arrangements. Yang Shi lowered her head and read them seriously, hardly looking up the whole time, so she didn't notice that the man in the rearview mirror was looking at her with an exceptionally gloomy look. Arrived at the hospital. Yang Shi put away her phone, opened the car door and got out. One of the patients she co-managed had complications and is now in the emergency room. She had to get there quickly. Lu Fangfei just arrived at the hospital. After stopping the car, she quickly walked towards Yang Shi, and the two of them went straight into the hospital. Yu Sighting watched her get out of the car quickly and walk into the hospital without even looking back. She didn't even say hello to him and his face sank. Zhao Shuai was helped by the new nurse to get out of bed and move around. When she saw Yu Sighting's car driving in, her face showed some excitement, but her wound still hurt with every step she took, so she didn't dare to move forward quickly. She moved slowly with the help of the nurse. She watched Yang Shi get out of the back seat with a slightly stunned expression. Yang Shi and Lu Fangfei walked in together. She glanced at Zhao Shuai who was being supported by a nurse, her expression calm. Zhao Shuai must have seen her getting out of Yu Sighting's car just now, so she looked so surprised. The elevator happened to open, and Yang Shi didn't bother to explain and stepped into the elevator. Lu Fangfei was talking to Yang Shi about the patient's condition. Yang Shi listened quietly, and when she raised her eyes, she saw Yu Sighting walking in from outside the hospital. His expression looked unnatural, and it was obvious that he had noticed Zhao Shuai, so he hurried up to explain. The elevator door closed. Yang Shi withdrew her gaze, and discussed the solution with Lu Fangfei in a low voice. After getting out of the elevator, Yang Shi devoted all her energy to work. When Yu Sighting started the car and was about to leave, he looked up at the rearview mirror and saw a bracelet on the back seat. The hospital has regulations that medical staff cannot wear any jewelry, so Yang Shi would take off the bracelet she was wearing and put it in her bag before entering the hospital. She was checking messages while putting the bracelet into her bag, and she didn't notice that the bracelet fell on the seat and was no longer in her bag. Yu Sighting stopped the car, took the bracelet from the back seat, got out of the car and handed it to Yang Shi. He had seen Yang Shi wearing this bracelet many times, and she must have liked it very much. When he entered the hospital, he saw a nurse supporting Zhao Shuai standing in the hospital lobby. Yang Shi stood in the elevator with a calm expression, listening to the people around her talking. Her eyes were gentle and she didn't mind Zhao Shuai's presence at all. Yu Sighting's face suddenly darkened. Zhao Shuai bit her lip lightly. Sighting, you sent Dr. Yang to the hospital. Yu Sighting glanced at her calmly, his eyes calm. Why did you come downstairs? Zhao Shuai looked obedient. Dr. Yang said that I can get out of bed and move around a little during this period. If I keep lying down, adhesions will form in the uterus, and I may not be able to have a baby in the future. Yu Sighting just nodded slightly and lowered his eyes to glance at his phone. I'm going to the company first, take care of yourself. His voice without any warmth sounded again, and he walked away. Zhao Shuai noticed the bracelet in his hand and spoke quickly. Sighting, is this bracelet Dr. Yang's? I can pass it on to Dr. Yang for you. Yu Sighting lowered his eyes and glanced at the bracelet in his hand. His eyes turned slightly cold and he put it directly into his trouser pocket. No need, he said, and strode away. Zhao Shuai looked at his back as he left and gritted her teeth. The nurse quietly supported Zhao Shuai, and seeing that her face looked bad, she didn't dare to breathe. Ms. Zhao, shall I help you back to the ward? Zhao Shuai said, Yang Shi has been busy since she entered the department. There were a lot of patients during this period, and Yangshi was assigned to several new patients. After sorting out all the patient information, Yangshi breathed a sigh of relief and sat in the office to drink a sip of water. As soon as she put down the cup of water, Zhao Shuai walked to the door with the help of the nurse. Dr. Yang. Yangshi raised her eyebrows slightly. Sit down. Zhao Shuai then slowly moved her body and walked to the chair and sat down. After she sat down, she immediately said to the nurse beside her, Auntie, I want to talk to Dr. Yang alone. The nurse heard the voice, nodded, and left. Yangshi looked at Zhao Shuai quietly, without changing her expression, and searched for information. Zhao Shuai looked at Yangshi calmly for a while before she spoke. Dr. Yang, I saw you getting out of Sai Ting's car this morning. Was it Mrs. Yu who asked Sai Ting to pick you up? Yangshi paused for a moment and looked up at Yangshi. Boss, you didn't explain to you. Zhao Shuai was stunned for a few seconds and then spoke softly. Sai Ting explained it to me, but I don't quite believe what he said, so I still want to ask you. Yangshi raised her eyebrows. You don't believe him, but you believe me. Miss Zhao, aren't you afraid that I will sow discord between you? Zhao Shuai bit her lip lightly. It's not that I don't believe him at all, but I also want to hear what Miss Yang has to say. Yangshi took out the patient's information and placed it on the desk, tapping it lightly with her fingers. Ms. Zhao, I'm busy. If it's not a physical problem, then please don't bother me for now, okay? Yangshi's voice was gentle when she spoke, but it also carried a firmness that could not be refused. Zhao Shuai's eyes were embarrassed, and she said softly, I'm sorry, Dr. Yang, I was abrupt. She stood up from her chair and walked slowly out of Yangshi's office. Yangshi looked at Zhao Shuai walking out, sat in her chair in a daze for a long time, and then returned to her work. Zhao Shuai didn't bother her again because of Yu Sighting's affairs. Yangshi was doing rounds before leaving get off work, and when she walked into Zhao Shuai's ward, she greeted her warmly as always. Dr. Yang. Yangshi nodded slightly, gave Zhao Shuai a few instructions, and when she was about to leave, she saw Yu Sighting walking out of the bathroom. It turns out this man has been here all along. Yangshi raised her eyebrows, said nothing, turned around and left. However, Zhao Shuai took the initiative to call Yangshi, with a gentle and generous smile. Dr. Yang, are you almost off work? Sai Ting is leaving too. You came to the hospital in Sai Ting's car this morning instead of driving yourself. It just so happens that you can leave in Sai Ting's car. Yu Sighting stood at the door of the bathroom and glanced at Zhao Shuai when he heard the voice. Zhao Shuai smiled softly and said seriously, Sai Ting, are you bothered by this? Yangshi watched the interaction between the two with a calm expression and refused. No. Someone is here to pick me up. Qin Shicheng and Xiao Cheng have some friendship. Qin Shicheng invited Xiao Cheng and Yang Ruyu to have dinner together, intending to resolve the dispute over the land in the western suburbs. Xiao Cheng is a well-known playboy in Yuncheng, and he has always been interested in Yang Ruyu. She was worried and planned to go together. Chapter 25 I Can't Help You. Zhao Shuai smiled slightly, a little gossipy. Is your boyfriend here to pick you up? Yangshi did not answer her and walked out of Zhao Shuai's ward. Yu Sighting looked at her back and his eyes darkened. Zhao Shuai curled her red lips slightly, her eyes fell on Yu Sighting. Sighting, you and Dr. Yang are also sworn brothers and sisters. Have you met Dr. Yang's boyfriend? Yu Sighting's eyes were cold. I haven't seen it. After he finished speaking, he lowered his head and glanced at his watch, then spoke solemnly. I have something else to do. I'm leaving now. Zhao Shuai wanted to keep Yu Sighting, but before she could say anything, she just opened her mouth and the man walked out of the ward. He looked anxious, as if something urgent had happened. She scowled and clenched her palms. After Yangshi went to the storage room and changed out of her work clothes, she received a call from Qin Shicheng. Xiaoxi, there's a traffic jam here, you may need to wait for me for a while. Yangshi replied softly, it's okay, I can go see my dad at the same time. Qin Shicheng, okay, I'll call you when I get there. Yangshi uttered a soft hum. After hanging up the call, Yangshi lowered her eyes and glanced at her wrist, then opened her handbag and prepared to take out the bracelet and put it on. This bracelet was a birthday gift from her father when she was 18. Her father said the bracelet was once her mother's favorite piece of jewelry. Yangshi has never seen her mother since she was a child, so this bracelet has a different meaning to her. After she took out everything from the bag, she still didn't see the bracelet. There is none in the lockers either. She clearly remembered that she wore it when she went out in the morning. She immediately walked out of the storage room and called Yuncheng. Yuncheng was on the phone. She frowned, and when she looked up, she saw the man standing in the elevator, answering the phone. The moment the elevator door closed, Yuncheng raised his eyes and glanced in the direction of Yang Shi. There was no warmth in his black eyes. Yang Shi hurried over and found that the elevator door was completely closed. When she went downstairs, Yuncheng's car had already left. She sighed in resignation and headed to her father's hospital room. Mr. Yang has recovered well in the past 2 days and has started to get out of bed and exercise. Seeing Yang Shi coming over, Mr. Yang smiled and asked, "Are you off work?" As he spoke, he glanced behind Yang Shi. "Where's Sai Ting? Isn't he here to pick you up after get off work?" Yang Shi paused. "Has he been to your place?" Aunt Wang walked into the ward carrying some fruit. When she heard Yang Shi's question, she smiled and said, "My son-in-law came over this afternoon and chatted with you for a while. He went upstairs when he saw that it was time for you to get off work." Yang Shi raised her eyebrows when she heard the voice. She thought Yuncheng had always been in Zhao Shuai's ward with her. It seems that she misunderstood him. Aunt Wang didn't see Yuncheng, so she also asked, "Why don't you see my uncle? I wonder if you guys have gone astray." Seeing her father's inquiring look, Yang Shi replied softly, "No. He had something to do at the company, so he went to take care of it first." After hearing this, Mr. Yang's expression relaxed a little. "Seeing that your relationship with Sai Ting is so stable, I feel relieved." When Yang Shi first married into the Yu family, Mr. Yang was always worried that she would be wronged. After all, so many years have passed, and Yuncheng and Yang Shi only have a marriage certificate, not even a decent wedding. Mr. Yang had known that there was someone else living in Yuncheng's heart, so he had always refused to hold a wedding with Yang Shi. This time when the Yang group got into trouble, all the burdens fell on Yang Ruyu. Although Yuncheng did not do anything substantial, he helped a lot in an indirect way. Mr. Yang was quite satisfied with Yuncheng as his son-in-law. Yang Shi pursed her lips slightly without saying much. She knew very well the status of her marriage with Yuncheng. Her father is still recovering, and Yang Shi doesn't want her father to worry about her emotional problems. Yang Shi chatted with her father in the ward for a while when Qin Shichen called. She answered the call and said goodbye to her father and left. When Aunt Wang saw Yang Shi was about to leave, she sent Yang Shi downstairs. "Auntie Wang, you can go back and take care of my father. You don't have to send me off. Thank you for your hard work." Aunt Wang smiled, exchanged a few words with Yang Shi, and turned back to the hospital. After walking a few steps, she remembered that Mr. Yang would be discharged from the hospital tomorrow, so she planned to have them all go back to Yang's house for dinner. Just now, Mr. Yang seemed to have forgotten to mention this matter to Yang Shi. Aunt Wang was planning to convey a message on her behalf, but she saw Qin Shichen drive the car to Yang Shi, get out and open the door for Yang Shi. Qin Shichen put his hand lightly around Yang Shi's waist and helped her into the car like a gentleman. In Aunt Wang's opinion, the relationship between the two is very close. Yang Shi had a smile on her face, and Qin Shichen also had a gentle look on his face. The perfect match reminded Aunt Wang of the awkward and strange atmosphere when Yuncheng came to their hospital to have dinner with Mr. Yang that day. Aunt Wang took a deep breath, and a bold guess came to her mind. Could it be that their young lady is having an affair? Yang Shi got into Qin Shichen's car with a polite smile. "Shichen, sorry to bother you again." Qin Shichen had a smile on his face, looking gentle. "No trouble, I'll be happy to do it. It's just that Xiao Cheng is more difficult to deal with. I have sounded out his attitude, and from what he said, he doesn't want to sell the land." Yang Shi frowned. The Yang family had already bought that piece of land from the Xiao family a long time ago. Xiao Cheng is deliberately making things difficult for them. He clearly believed that the Yang family couldn't afford to waste time in a lawsuit with him, and wanted to get a piece of the pie. Qin Shichen comforted Yang Shi softly, "It's okay, let's talk about it at the dinner table later. If he really insists on doing that, then we can only sue him. The Yang family may not lose the lawsuit." Yang Shi nodded slightly, and Qin Shichen's cell phone suddenly rang. He glanced and saw that it was a call from Xiao Cheng, so he slid over the answer button and answered the call. "Mr. Xiao." Xiao Cheng's lazy and casual voice sounded. "Boss Qin, I'm so sorry, I have another dinner tonight, I'm afraid I can't come." Qin Shichen's face darkened slightly, and he looked serious. "Mr. Xiao, I have already made an appointment with Miss Yang. You suddenly changed your mind." I. Xiao Cheng interrupted Qin Shicheng with a smile without waiting for him to finish speaking. I really can't turn down this dinner tonight, mainly because Mr. Zhao is the one who's treating. Mr. Zhao is a highly respected elder in the business circle of Yuncheng. Most of the young people in the business circle of Yuncheng have received support and guidance from Mr. Zhao. The Xiao family almost went bankrupt, and it was thanks to Mr. Zhao's guarantee that they were able to come back to life. Xiao Cheng really couldn't refuse this dinner. Chapter 26. Who says only beautiful women can lie? Qin Shicheng has been abroad for many years, and most of the Qin family's assets are abroad. Therefore, the Qin family and Mr. Zhao do not have a deep relationship. When Qin Shicheng went abroad, he had not yet taken over the Qin family's business, so he had never met Mr. Zhao. What he is mobilizing now are nothing more than the connections that the Qin family had left behind before he went abroad. Xiao Cheng saw that Qin Shicheng didn't say anything and just smiled. I'm really sorry, Mr. Qin. I'll treat you and Mr. Yang to dinner some other day. I'm hanging up now. Bye. After Xiao Cheng hung up the call, Yang Ruyu called again. Qin Shicheng saw that it was Yang Ruyu calling and answered the call. Sister Ruyu. Yang Ruyu said, and apologized first. Shicheng, I'm sorry, I can't come to the dinner tonight. Did Xiao Cheng call you just now? Qin Shicheng, yes. Did Mr. Zhao invite you too? Yang Ruyu replied, yes. Yang Shi and I are going to go there too. Is Yang Shi in your car? Qin Shicheng glanced at Yang Shi, a hint of frustration flashing in his eyes. Yes. Yang Ruyu immediately said, I'll come pick her up right away. Qin Shicheng, okay. After Yang Ruyu hung up the call, she immediately drove over here. Qin Shicheng put away his phone and looked at Yang Shi. Xiao Shi, I'm really sorry that I couldn't help you this time. With Elder Zhao stepping forward, this matter will definitely be resolved, and you don't have to worry about it. Although Yang Shi was not from the business circle, she knew who Mr. Zhao was. When the Yang family was at its peak, Mr. Zhao often visited the Yang family. However, the Yang family later declined, and some of the noble families that had a good relationship with the Yang family have obviously become estranged from them over the years. Yang Shi clearly saw the frustration in Qin Shicheng's eyes, and she immediately spoke politely. We are sorry. We had agreed to have dinner together, but now we have been delayed by other things. I'm really sorry to bother you these past few days. Qin Shicheng did not answer, and the smile on his lips was a little bitter. Yang Ruyu had already approached Mr. Zhao before, but the Zhao family had always declined on the grounds that Mr. Zhao was not in good health. This time, Mr. Zhao suddenly invited Xiao Cheng and Yang Ruyu to have dinner at the Zhao family. It must have been Yuncheng's doing. He didn't have much confidence in this lobbying. After all, his friendship with Xiao Cheng went back many years. Now that Mr. Zhao has intervened, this matter will definitely be resolved satisfactorily. Yuncheng only needs to say a few words to help the Yang group resolve the crisis. This made Qin Shicheng feel deeply powerless. Yang Ruyu's car drove over quickly. After Yang Shi and Qin Shicheng said goodbye, they got out of the car and got into Yang Ruyu's car, and went to the Zhao family together. In front of Zhao's house, Yuncheng's car was parked on the side of the road. When Yang Shi opened the car door and got out, Yuncheng also got out of the car. His deep black eyes fell on Yang Shi. He didn't say anything, but just waved at her. Yang Shi paused and stood there in a daze. Yang Ruyu said softly, it was he who called Mr. Zhao to lobby him, and only then did Mr. Zhao agree to come forward and make the decision for the Yang family. Upon hearing the voice, Yang Shi pursed her lips slightly, suppressed the strangeness in her heart, and walked towards the man. As soon as she walked in, Yuncheng put his arm around her waist with an indifferent tone. Mr. Zhao has always wanted to see my wife. Yang Shi suddenly became nervous. This was the first time Yuncheng took her out for a social event. Noticing her somewhat stiff limbs, Yuncheng lowered his eyes, and his narrow eyes fell on her with a sarcastic smile. Were you not quite capable when you went to dinner with those real estate developers before? Yang Shi. Yuncheng hugged her tightly and pulled her towards him. Don't be afraid, Mr. Zhao doesn't eat people. Besides, your sister will handle anything that comes up. Yang Ruyu followed behind them, and when she saw Yuncheng pointed at her, she looked at Yang Shi. It's okay, Xiao Shi, I'm here. With Yang Ruyu's words, Yang Shi inexplicably felt safe. However, the faint fragrance from Yuncheng made Yang Shi feel a little uncomfortable. She used to like the smell of him, but ever since she learned the origin of the smell in Zhao Shuai's ward that day, she felt disgusted from the bottom of her heart. All the way into the living room, Mr. Zhao was sitting on the sofa chatting with a few young people. He likes lively occasions, so he holds a family dinner every month and specially invites some younger generations to come to his home for dinner. Yang Ruyu just stepped into the living room and paused. Ji Yusenya was sitting opposite Mr. Zhao, talking to him with a smile. His words and actions were full of maturity and stability, with a slick back hair, which was completely different from the sunny and trendy boy he used to be. She didn't expect Ji Yusenya to be here. I thought that Mr. Zhao only invited Yu Sighting, them and Xiaocheng today. When Mr. Zhao saw Yu Sighting coming with Yang Shi and Yang Ruyu, he smiled and nodded with a kind look on his face. Sighting is here, please sit down. Yu Sighting nodded, put his arm around Yang Shi and sat down opposite Mr. Zhao. Yang Shi saw that Mr. Zhao's eyes fell on her and said softly, "Grandpa Zhao, long time no see." Mr. Zhao nodded slightly, and was very satisfied with Yang Shi's address. "You were just a crybaby who used to cry and follow your sister, but now you have grown up into a beautiful lady. I heard that you work in a hospital now." Yang Shi nodded quickly. "Yes, Grandpa Zhao." Mr. Zhao smiled charitably and said, "The future of being a doctor is good. It is a profession that deserves respect. Is your father feeling better?" Yang Shi nodded gently, "Much better, I can be discharged from the hospital tomorrow." Mr. Zhao nodded, then changed the subject and looked at Yu Sighting. "Come to think of it, I haven't even had the chance to drink at your wedding with Sighting. Doesn't Sighting plan to re-hold the wedding?" Yu Sighting looked normal, and his arm around Yang Shi tightened slightly. After a long while, he answered, "I'm quite busy at this time, I will seriously consider it after a while." He answered sincerely. If they were not about to get divorced, Yang Shi would have been deceived by Yu Sighting's honesty at this moment. Who says only beautiful women can lie? She thought Yu Sighting was quite good at lying. Yang Ruyu sat down next to Yang Shi and took the initiative to greet Mr. Zhao. Mr. Zhao has always been quite satisfied with Yang Ruyu. Among all these aristocratic families, only the Yang family has no son. As a daughter, Yang Ruyu is a very successful business person, and Mr. Zhao appreciates her very much. If the Zhao family had not run out of male heirs of marriageable age, old Zhao would have really married Yang Ruyu to his family as his grandson's wife. Perhaps because he is getting older, he is particularly worried about the marriage of young people, especially since Yang Ruyu is almost 30 years old. So Mr. Zhao glanced at Ji Yusenya beside him, and then looked at Yang Ruyu. Ruyu is still unmarried, right? Yang Ruyu didn't look at Ji Yusenya the whole time, and replied lightly, "No. My father has been worried about my marriage recently. I wonder if Grandpa Zhao has a suitable candidate. He can introduce me to someone." Suddenly, a teasing voice was heard outside the door. "Am I not the best candidate?" Chapter 27. This man's considerate acting skills. Xiao Cheng's voice was the first to sound from the door, and Yang Shi couldn't help but frowned. To Yang Shi, Xiao Cheng is as annoying as he you. How could such a person be worthy of her sister? A hint of worry flashed in her eyes. She was really worried that Mr. Zhao would match people up randomly. She immediately set her sights on Ji Yusenya, who was beside Mr. Zhao. Ji Yusenya is the only man Yang Shi knows who has dated her sister. Yu Sighting glanced sideways and saw that her eyes fell on Ji Yusenya. He reached out and gently pinched her waist, pulling her closer to him. A hint of displeasure flashed across his deep black eyes. Yang Shi withdrew her gaze and looked at Yu Sighting with some confusion. Yu Sighting just glanced at her secretly, with a slight warning in his eyes. Mr. Zhao noticed Yu Sighting's movements and smiled knowingly. This was the first time that Yu Sighting brought his wife to his place, so Mr. Zhao's attention was definitely more on Yang Shi. His impression of Yang Shi still remains in the stage many years ago when she was a little crybaby who was well protected by her sister and father. Yang Shi felt a little uncomfortable when she saw Mr. Zhao's gaze on them, so she reached out and pushed Yu Sighting. Yu Sighting just curled his lips slightly, but still didn't let go of his hand. As Xiao Cheng walked towards him, he caught a glimpse of Yu Sighting's gaze on him, with a hint of hostility in it. Xiao Cheng thought about it and realized that he had not offended Yu Sighting, so he put on a smile again and sat down next to Yang Ruyu. "Boss Yang, we meet again." Yang Ruyu looked indifferent and nodded slightly as a greeting. The long sofa where they were sitting seemed a bit crowded as 4 people were sitting on it at the same time. Yang Ruyu moved towards Yang Shi calmly. Yang Shi could only move closer to Yu Sighting. Yu Sighting hugged Yang Shi tightly. Yang Shi felt that if she continued to lean towards him, she would soon sit in his arms. Only then was there a little space between Xiao Cheng and Yang Ruyu. In the end, Yang Ruyu naturally got up from the sofa, walked to Ji Yu Senya's side and sat down. Ji Yu Senya's expression was indifferent, and he never gave Yang Ruyu a single extra glance from beginning to end. Seeing that Yang Ruyu kept a distance from him, Xiao Cheng was not annoyed and still smiled. Mr. Zhao, you are going to introduce a blind date to Mr. Yang. Take a look at me and see if I am worthy of Mr. Yang. Old Zhao still had a benevolent smile on his face. He looked at Xiao Cheng and then at Yang Ruyu. Seeing a hint of alienation in Yang Ruyu's eyes, he smiled. Mr. Xiao is a young talent, so he is naturally worthy of Ruyu. Ruyu is so outstanding, so she naturally has no shortage of suitors. I am old now, and you young people now advocate freedom of love, so I will not get involved. It was obvious that Mr. Zhao was just being polite. I don't want to take this relationship seriously. After all, Xiao Cheng has a bad reputation and is a well-known playboy in Yuncheng, while Yang Ruyu is the successor of the Yang family, a clean family. It is impossible for Master Zhao to harm Yang Ruyu. Seeing that Ji Yu Senya, who was sitting next to Mr. Zhao, looked unmoved, Yang Shi took a deep breath and glanced at Yang Ruyu cautiously. Yang Ruyu looked normal. Grandpa Zhao is still young, not old at all. While they were chatting, dinner was already prepared in the kitchen. Mr. Zhao invited several people to enter the restaurant and take their seats. Maybe it was because Yu Sighting was extra caring towards Yang Shi in front of Mr. Zhao that Yang Shi even felt a little uncomfortable. Xiao Cheng sat next to Yang Ruyu with a smile on his face and took the initiative to talk about the land. In front of Mr. Zhao, Xiao Cheng didn't dare to be too arrogant. Mr. Zhao acted as a peacemaker for Yu Sighting's sake. Ji Yu Senya hasn't spoken much since Yang Ruyu came to the Zhao family. He was a gentle and elegant man before, but now his face looked very serious and it was hard to tell what he was thinking. Yang Shi couldn't help but look at Ji Yu Senya a few more times. After all, when Ji Yu Senya liked Yang Ruyu, he was willing to give his life to Yang Ruyu. Now he has become so cold, Yang Shi couldn't believe it. Yu Sighting picked up a piece of food with chopsticks and put it in Yang Shi's bowl with an unfriendly look. She frequently looked towards Ji Yu Senya, which made him extremely unhappy. Yang Shi quickly retracted her gaze and pursed her lips. After the dinner, Mr. Zhao called Yang Ruyu, Xiao Cheng and Ji Yu Senya to the study to talk. Yu Sighting and Yang Shi sat in the living room waiting. When entering the study, Yang Shi looked at Yang Ruyu nervously. Yang Ruyu gave Yang Shi a reassuring look and went into the study. Half an hour later, Ji Yu Senya was the first to walk out of the study. He looked unhappy. He picked up his coat on the sofa and left. Yu Sighting glanced at Ji Yu Senya and raised his eyebrows slightly. Yang Shi frowned slightly. After a few minutes, Xiao Cheng and Yang Ruyu came out of the study. Xiao Cheng still had a smile on his face. Yang Ruyu looked normal, without showing much emotion. Mr. Zhao then walked out of the study, smiled benevolently, and looked at Yu Sighting and Yang Shi. I'm going to rest now. You guys should go back and rest as well. Sighting, bring Xiao Shi here more often in the future. Hearing this, Yu Sighting nodded. Several people walked out of Zhao's house. Yu Sighting took Yang Shi to the car, opened the passenger door and let Yang Shi sit in. Yang Shi's eyes were fixed on the direction where Yang Ruyu and Xiao Cheng were. Although Xiao Cheng listened to Mr. Zhao's advice and gave up the land in the western suburbs, he kept using it as an excuse to pester Yang Ruyu to give him a chance. He said that the piece of land in the western suburbs was his ticket to pursuing Yang Ruyu. Mr. Yang can solve it. Yu Sighting blocked Yang Shi's sight and motioned for her to get in the car. Yang Shi withdrew her gaze, bent down, entered the car and sat down. Yu Sighting closed the car door, walked around the front of the car and entered the driver's cabin. The distance between the two was very close. Yang Shi had always sat in the back seat of his car, and she felt a little uncomfortable with it. Yu Sighting drove the car all the way back to the old house. Yang Shi paused, and pursed her lips when she saw the car parked in the garage of the old house. In the past 3 years, Yu Sighting was unwilling to live in the old house at all. Even if old lady Yu tried her best to keep him, he would definitely leave after the old lady rested. This time the old lady asked them to stay in the old house with her. Yang Shi didn't expect Yu Sighting to be so cooperative. She pursed her lips and looked at the man beside her. After the car was turned off, Yuncheng unbuckled his seat belt. Seeing her looking at him, he reached out and pressed the seat belt buckle on Yang Shi's seat. The seat belt was unbuckled, and Yuncheng glanced at her indifferently. Seeing that she seemed to have no intention of getting out of the car, he spoke with a sullen face. If you don't want to live here, go and talk to the old lady yourself. Yang Shi. This is probably his true face. The considerate and gentle care I showed to Mr. Zhao just now was just an act. Men in their position always like to create a feeling of family harmony and no worries in front of others. Instead, she was deeply moved by the considerate acting skills of the man in front of her.